utilizing the same technologies that terrorists use in order to counter them. Improving AI literacy of terrorism, mid-level and top sector, practitioners, policy officers will be critical to address the forthcoming threat of misuse of new tech. And close cooperation with partners, obviously, including unconventional ones. That's vital. Terrorism has never been contained by national borders, and the developments in the online domain have supercharged this. Cooperation, jointly identifying knowledge gaps and sharing expertise and information is simply the only way forward. And what does this mean for the Netherlands? Offline, we have worked to ensure that our geographical focus and our PCV interventions are in line with the threat assessments for the Netherlands. Based on this mapping, in the past year, we have rebalanced our diplomatic network of regional and 5 bilateral security advisors where they are needed to ensure that this network remains fit for purpose. One practical result of this exercise is our investment in greater engagement in the Central Asia in the past years. In the online domain, the Netherlands government, in line with the European regulations, has launched a new regulatory and policy framework to combat online extremism and terrorist content. This is the so-called enhanced online approach, which combines both a domestic and international approach. A key deliverable in the government's approach is engagement with the internet sector and a critical dialogue with online platforms. This has not been easy, as you can probably imagine, but is the only way forward in a world where the influence of platforms like Meta and X rivals, or even increasingly exceeds that of most governments. That is why the Netherlands urges strongly to keep the terrorist threat emanating from online and cooperation with the tech sector high on the agenda of the international fora like GCTF, EU Internet Forum, and Christchurch Call, and the Global Internet Forum for Counter-Terrorism. For example, 2 weeks ago, we hosted a conference on a constructive dialogue between a group of 22 government representatives and the Global Internet Forum on Counter-Terrorism. This was a first but crucial step towards intensified collaboration and balanced accountability with internet platforms for countering violent extremism and terrorist content online. Dialogue is important, but we still need tools to actually combat terrorist activity. And the recent attacks by Hamas have again underscored how skillful terrorist organizations are in online fundraising. Even though we have made great strides in countering of terrorist financing, we still have ways to go. And this is why the Netherlands has actively promoted sanctions as another mechanism to fight the financing of terrorists and cut that financing as well, and disrupt the financial streams. The Netherlands was one of the initiators of a dedicated European sanctions regime for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And at the same time, we were also the first European country to sanction a right-wing terrorist group, the Base, and we are pushing for this group to be included on the European sanctions list as well at the moment. As you can see, we have not been sitting still, and at the same time, we also realize that there's so much more work to be done, and there's very little what we can do. So all the help is needed, and especially all the expertise is needed. And as Thomas mentioned, we're gathered here from different backgrounds, practitioners, academia, and government representatives is very much needed to actually bring their different perspectives together at the same table. And that's why I'm very excited about today's conference and the opportunity to hear from you and from your specialist and expertise areas. And I hope that you will be able to come up with some thought-provoking discussions. Wishing you a very nice day and a fruitful conversation. Thank you.
So very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kacper Rękawek. I'm the Senior Fellow and Head of the Emerging Threats Pillar at ICCT. And what a plenary we have for you right now. I'll bring the speakers to the podium, so to speak, and I'll be introducing them. So Jonathan, Hans, Jakub and Lisbeth, you're here. If you could join us, I'll be introducing you all in a second. So maybe a short introduction from me first as to how we would like to play it. We have an hour and 15 minutes to do this. And in the hour and 15 minutes, we're going to do three things. First, we have given our great speakers an opportunity to actually lay their case in front of us for a few minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a Q&A between us and a discussion. And then obviously the floor is open to you and also the internet side of things as well. So we're going to be taking questions from that side as well. Now, it is a bit provocative in terms of Houston, we have a problem, uncertain age of uncertainty. And obviously we just wanted to make sure that we get you all going in this sense to think about the unthinkable in a way, and drawing on the experience and the expertise of the four people in the room who come to the table from different, let's say, quarters, if you like. And please feel provoked, let's put it this way. We'll try and make sure that we get a good discussion going on the trends and the future of CT, PCVE, whatever term is closer to your heart. So as I said, 1 hour and 15 minutes, we'll try to cover all of this, and let me introduce our speakers. We start with Jonathan Hall, and I hope not to get that wrong, because Jonathan is an independent barrister in London, but he wears two hats, if I know correctly. One is from 2019. You are the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation in the UK, but there's another one, which is also an independent reviewer of the threats to the state threats legislation. So thank you for being here with us, Jonathan, and obviously Jonathan will be looking at the things from his corner, and the legal side of things will be looking up to you to discuss the future trends and the scale of the problem that we might be having. If we go in alphabetical order, Lisbeth van der Heide, who wears three hats. Okay, the main hat is the municipality doing PCVE in The Hague, so where we are, so that's one. Then there's the other one with Ischa, which is the University of Leiden, for those of you not familiar with the place. And then there's the third hat. You are an associate fellow of ours. So ICCT, so three hats, plenty of experience in the room. Thank you for being here with us. Then we move on to Jakub. Jakub represents the organization which is called the European Values, and Jakub has been in Prague, in Czech Republic. And Jakub has been at the forefront of the, let's say, struggle that we have had with certain not so friendly countries, if I could put it this way, meaning first Russia and now on to China. And Jakub's been doing these things way before everybody else, so he's a bit of ahead of the curve, if you like, on this front. So thank you for being here with us, and obviously we're going to stretch the angle of CT in that direction as well. And last but not least, definitely, Hans-Jakob Schindler, who's here with us, Senior Director, Counter-Extremism Project, but also quite a ton of experience in interesting places, if I could put it this way. Iran, Gaza, UN, right, all in one sentence. Hans, thank you for being here with us. To all of our speakers, many thanks again. Let's stretch the field. Let's think the unthinkable. Let's think about the future. Let's discuss if there is a problem. But the first thing's this. I've asked each of you to think before about this, and let's play it like this. 3 minutes for each of you to tell me, tell us, tell everyone, and also people online, what's the trend in CT, PCVE that you see, that is emerging, that keeps you awake at night, or the trend that you like, maybe, that's going to be hitting us and that we will be discussing in these conferences for years to come. We go in alphabetical order, so I go to Jonathan first.
We all know that President Raisi crashed in a helicopter earlier this month. On Saturday in London, there was a demonstration by some individuals, dissidents, and they were attacked by supporters of the regime in London, and they were injured. Is that transnational repression? Because I can tell you from the perspective of a sort of insider-outsider, I'm an independent person, but I speak to government all the time, that is where the focus of the CT world is moving. It's moving not completely, but away from the lesser, I'm going to say lesser threats, and I want to be provocative about this, of certain types of terrorism to stuff that is done by or on behalf of or for the benefit of states. And the key difficulty in the context of transnational repression is how on earth do you prove that there is a state behind it? And that is going to be the fundamental problem, I think, for dealing with this sort of material, as well as the difficulty of defining it. I'm a lawyer, so I want to see definitions. If there are special laws being passed, I want them to be capable of being judged. I want there to be an ability to prove or disprove. I don't want special powers to come along just because it's a trendy label. which is a risk. Now, what did I mention provocatively about certain counter-terrorism matters being of less weight? What I mean is we're now reaching a position, I think, with young children and neurodiverse young people committing offences, lone actors. It's very difficult, I think, to say that the foundations of states are being shaken by many of what they do. If a young person obsessed by some weird form of extreme right-wing terrorism starts to plot to go and carry a knife and kill a schoolmate, is that fundamentally attacking the state? I mean, that's a question I would raise, but that's what we're looking at the moment in the counter-terrorism field. I wonder whether or not there's some merit in moving a bit towards a model where you say, let's look at national security threats, and actually some of these things that we think about as terrorism aren't so different from knife fights, and they certainly have much less impact on individuals than knife killings in North London, where there are up to hundreds over the years. The second thing I want to mention I was going to mention AI, but it sounds like someone else is going to talk about it. But can I just say the internet is just so fundamentally important. 4 hours a day, I think, is what our Ofcom, which is the regulator, is estimating that people are spending on time. It's only going to get worse. As a lawyer, the key question is we can talk about collaborating with tech companies, we can talk about regulatory frameworks, but someone has got to make a decision about what are the priorities and how you define these priorities. In the UK, we have something called the Online Safety Act, and it mandates tech companies to spend most of their time and resources focusing on terrorist offences. So the question about what actually are terrorist offences online is really, really vitally important. My own personal view is that although collaboration is vital, ultimately it's for democratic states, democracies, to start to set some of the standards and start to export some of those to the tech companies despite their First Amendment things. The last thing I'd say, chatbots, really, really hard. If you're a lawyer, how do you prosecute a chatbot? You can't, it's not a person. How do you prosecute someone who's in a dialogue with a chatbot? Well, it's not incitement, because we think about incitement as one person talking to another person. So I would say, from a legal point of view, if we're talking about liability, we have to look at the, dare I say it, the AI life cycle, the role of programmers, the role of trainers, the role of data providers, the roles of disseminators, the roles of APIs. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, Jonathan, I think you've got us covered for the next few years, to be honest with you, but thank you for that. I'm happy that we can now move on to Lisbeth, because obviously Jonathan reviews the legislation that impacts you as someone working in PCVE at the local level, so I'm happy to hear your thoughts on the upcoming trend and how fun it is to work in that line of work.
Well, weirdly enough, it has always been fun, and the more complex it gets, the more challenging in a good way as well. But yeah, when I thought about this, I thought you're probably all familiar with the quote, if it looks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, and if it quacks like a duck. I'm not sure if the quote ends with it is a duck or it probably is a duck, but suffice to say, when it comes to countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, what we all have seen is when we talk about when it looks like a duck, we never knew what it looked like, what a person should look like, despite some people for some time thinking that a beard or wearing a jalaba would be any kind of indication. It's not. We know that, and we will probably never have a visual picture of what a terrorist looks like. When it comes to swimming like a duck, I'd say that over the past maybe 2 decades, we at the very least established a pretty common understanding and a lot of knowledge on what jihadism looked like, including its modus operandi, transnational networks, command control structures, and so on. That has changed with the phenomenon that we're dealing with today when it comes to right-wing extremism, accelerationists, but also when it comes to the sovereign citizen movement. It's much less established what that looks like. And when it comes to the final one, quacking like a duck, I was thinking on the one hand, we have a lot of ducks quacking, and then we have a lot of ducks quacking both offline and online, and it's become much harder to determine, well, in line with what you were saying as well, what is it that they're doing? Is it activism? Is it extremism? If it's extremism, is it violent? Is that determined by any ideology or elements of an ideology, or is that determined by action and behavior? And if it's extremism, is it violent or is it non-violent or not yet violent? That's become very difficult to illustrate. Well, I work at the municipality of The Hague. After October 7th, 80% of my work has become focusing on what goes on in Gaza, in Israel, and how that affects polarization and maybe polarization towards radicalization or not. We still don't know yet, and it's very hard to establish that. In February, we had an event with people with an Eritrean background coming to transnational repression. That's become my job ever since, basically because no one really knew where it belonged at the municipality, because we didn't really have a team to deal with transnational repression, including answering the question, again, is this transnational repression and how do we know? So it's become much more difficult, and then 2 and 3 are interrelated. That's difficult, and there's that online dimension there where I feel when I used to work at ICT, you write these things saying like our government should step up, we're behind. Right now, after 4 years in practice, I'd say we're way behind. I mean, on the local level, we're still asking around and no one really knows the answer. What are we allowed to do online to begin with? And we keep saying, look, online is as important, if not more important, than offline. It incites things that happen offline. But basically, no one's doing really anything with it because no one knows. It's not that we cannot do stuff online on the local government level. It's more no one starts because no one is sure whether we're allowed to. And then the third and final point to add to that, when it comes to dealing with and what we should be doing, this is about the whole privacy point. So in light of the GDPR regulations, what I'm seeing is that in the wake of jihadism, we established a whole approach in the Netherlands and elsewhere where a lot of information was shared. Too much information often, also because a lot of actors are thinking we don't want to be the one who didn't share information and then something bad happens. Nowadays, from a practitioner perspective, I think the pendulum has swung entirely the other way, where, again, not so much because actors aren't allowed to share information, but much more what I'm seeing is that actors do not know whether they are allowed to share information, and if so, to what extent. And as a result, we have to deal with online. We don't really know who should be dealing with it and what is allowed to be shared. And as a result, I feel that as a field, we're kind of watching it unfold, not really knowing what to do with it.
Okay, so Lisbeth, you're saying the train is kind of leaving the station and we're here.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, we have Jakub, who's next, who's been kind of ahead of the curve on a couple of issues. So, no pressure on you, Jakub, absolutely, but just tell us what to do, how it looks from your side.
Thank you, and I'll do my 3-minute time clock. I come from Prague. I sit in Central Europe, so let me give you where I think we are. Pretty much of Central Northern Europe is preparing for a possible defensive war with Russia, and that's something what is the core of the thinking, which overlaps into your field, where practically the thinking until recently was war is an effort of any military. But in a context of Russia, what we see Russia doing in Ukraine and Russia preparing to do against Eastern European and Central European nations of NATO, is that the overlaps are very big. Just to give you a couple of practical examples. October 2014, there was a Russian terrorist attack in the Czech Republic organized by Russian state called GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, where basically a team of operatives blew up an ammunition depot, killed 2 Czech citizens, caused immense damage, and it was a huge GRU operation, which similarly played out in Bulgaria. That's what happened. In early March 2022, I can just share, just to give you an understanding how it looked like in the case of Prague, for example. As the Russian attack on Ukraine started, we had hundreds and low thousands of Ukrainian citizens leaving Czech Republic to go into combat into Ukraine. But what was happening at the same time was there was a high level of fears in Prague, for example, that there would be Russian terrorist attack organized by Russian state inside the city of Prague, as for example there were places where there were Ukrainian citizens training with small weapons because they didn't know if they go back to Ukraine and they go to the front line whether they'll get any of the basic trainings over there, whether there'll be time for that. So they were doing it in the Czech Republic, and the fears are what would the Russian illegals be doing to actually cripple that. And it was very real, honestly. There were people, civilians who were going around the city armed because they were expecting this would be happening, because our police expected this to happen. Fortunately, it didn't happen back then. But very practically, what I think on China we could really look into as well. China is really, unfortunately, a strong allied partnership with Russia, and very clearly, what I think, just to give you a list of things which I think we need to be discussing in the future, Chinese illegal so-called police stations, which are basically intelligence gathering stations inside of EU countries. They are used for kidnapping not only Chinese citizen, quite often European citizen, from European countries. There is quite a lot of fears how China might actually use their economic dependencies to European countries in two particular scenarios, which let me just spell them out quickly. One, if NATO is in a defensive war with Russia in next 1 to 5 years, that's the time scope which our military leaders are looking into. If this happens, what would China be doing during that time to actually sabotage the defenses of mainly Central European nations? And there are so many entry points which China could be using, which unfortunately spill over into our national decision making as well. From electric car command center of solar panels, things which everybody would consider, oh, this is just civilian thing, nobody should care about, right? But there are so many overlaps to defense preparations that now the wide feeling of the military preparations, at least in Central European countries where I work, is actually starting to cover all of these aspects, because they will actually be quite important for us, unfortunately, in upcoming years. And just to finish up, last thing to mention, the most likely, hopefully not, but the most likely scenario which we might see China do around Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan might be a quarantine around using Chinese Navy and Air Force. And the question is, how in that scenario would actually European countries be hit through economic and technological dependencies, which then spill over into all of our security situations with Russia? So happy to discuss more in the discussion, but I wanted to make it short.
Thank you. It's not getting really optimistic here, around the table. And I don't think it's going to get any more optimistic with Hans, but you're my last hope. Hans, over to you.
Well, no, not really. So, I mean, the good thing is I feel very young, because when I started to study counterterrorism in 96, counterterrorism or terrorism was a niche subject, because, left-wing extremism, terrorism fueled by the Soviet Union was over for the lack of a Soviet Union. And we had Oslo, so, what terrorism? Why would you even study that? And we missed that there's this weird dude in Afghanistan who, did a lot of strange things, talked a lot of long, boring videos in Arabic, and then all of a sudden there were amazing real estate opportunities in southern Manhattan, right? And I feel I have the same arguments again now, right? So a couple of 30,000 feet view on terrorism status right now. So first of all, the model of territorial control has really caught on, right? We have West Africa, 45% of Burkina Faso, 40% of Mali, 20% of Niger, growing numbers out of control of the government and variable between Jinim, ISWAP, or IS Sahel province under control of terrorist organizations. We will have a 50-50 toss-up at the end of 2024, whether Somalia will exist as a country or will be run by Al-Shabaab. And really bad news is, from Afghanistan to West Africa to East Africa, we're very fast running out of countries who actually want to cooperate with us on the kinetic operations on which we should put our emphasis on, but we don't have any military bases left that would allow us to put our emphasis on, and we're getting replaced by the Russians. Now, we just heard, maybe not the most reliable counterterrorism partner that we could have at this particular point. So that's number one. Territorial control is back. Number two, the Palestinian issue is back, something that in particular in Europe we had very comfortably parked in some back room of our diplomatic efforts. There was the Quadriga and the Troika, but I mean, really, we just thought this is something we just don't have to deal with. And it's come back with a vengeance, as it does when you don't take care of an issue, in several ways. Number one, it is exacerbating divisions in our own society. Number two, it actually now develops into an actual concrete terror threat by Palestinian organizations as well. There is very much propaganda from Hamas on a daily basis, saying it's about time that you do something in Europe. And as people here in the Netherlands and me in our office in Germany were very well aware of, we had arrested a Hamas cell who was actually looking for an arms dump that was then subsequently found in Bulgaria, which was done several years ago. So this was always plan B of Hamas. As my colleague Guido Steinberg says regional terror organizations are only regional until they decide no longer to be. Right? So this is something we have to contend with. On top of all of this, we have a rise of anti-Semitism where really all of the extremism meet in our societies, whether it's the alliance of the extreme left with the Islamists, whether it's the alliance of the right-wing extremists with left-wing extremists, undermining the stability of our society. And here we do have a society problem because it is the door open to everything that you spoke about, right? And you spoke about. The malign actors who are very much watching this. We're just documenting at the moment on how Russian disinformation campaigns react to what's happening on US campuses. Right, so we have that problem. Again, that's something that we neglected a little bit, that it is an undercurrent. We fell victim to a shift in the way things are formulated and thought we somehow moved past anti-Semitism and just came back quite hitting us in the head. All of this would just be tragic if we had significant elections like in Europe or in North America this year. But luckily we don't, so that's my positive point.
Thank you, Hans. So I think one thing's pretty certain. Here you have all the speakers. We probably have a good title for that conference, let's say, because we clearly seem to have a string of problems and challenges and issues that we need to deal with. And I swear to God, I didn't ask the speakers to be that pessimistic, but hey, here we are. Maybe I'll turn to Jonathan now first. So let's do a, internal Q&A, if you like, before turning over to the audience, because I was always under the impression, a bit provocatively, that terrorism is done from below. It's a bunch of people who get together and attack the state, and that's called terrorism. Now, you spoke this magic term, transnational repression, and a couple of people here picked up on it. How do you see this? Who's in the game? How much is this political violence and terrorism, or is this something that we shouldn't be discussing here? Because there might be some people in the audience who would actually think so. It's the jihadis who are terrorism, and then right-wing nutcases, not states. So over to you.
Well, I think that we've all forgotten, haven't we? Dan Byman, who's I think at Washington University, he wrote an excellent book called Deadly Connections, and I recommend it strongly. The point is that the most capable terrorist organizations in the world have traditionally either been funded by or directed by or given facilities by states. We all in the 2010s and 2000s got used to if you like, the replacement model, where one body is saying, look, we want to achieve our own political objective, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and we forgot actually that there are these very capable terrorist organizations. Now what we're seeing, and I suppose this is why I'm quite pleased to be doing my additional role of looking at state threats, is that states coming in two ways. We know that they have been for a long time, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., assisting terrorist organizations, but now they're beginning to mobilize in other ways. It could be instrumentally. It could be like Russia might use the Wagner Group to carry out attacks in Western countries in order to achieve its strategic goals. But it might also be reaching into, I don't particularly like the word, diaspora groups in order to try and undermine social cohesiveness. So I think the state aspect has always been there, but we've forgotten about it a bit.
And you'd be expecting, Jonathan, that it's going to be creeping up,
Well, it's a bit like the internet, isn't it? I mean, we all, I mean, once countries like the UK, for example, our security service in 2018 or 19 decided to look at extreme right-wing terrorism, it found a lot of it. I suspect that now we're looking at state roles, we'll find a lot more of it. Subject to that really, really tricky issue, which is where you have got groups, you mentioned the Eritrea issue, we can't raise false expectations that the whole might of the counter-terrorism power, the security services, are going to be able to deal with these sorts of issues, because you come back to that unknowable problem where you've got two groups within a diaspora. You've got the loyalists and the patriots who say, don't you dare say that nasty thing about President Xi, and you've got the distance from Hong Kong. How do you prove that a foreign state is actually behind it? If that is going to be shown, it will be at the level of intelligence. It will be very difficult to use in legal proceedings or to break or have public debate about it. So I think we need to be careful about not raising false expectations about the role of the state.
As a responder
Yes.
in this case. Jakob, thank you, Jonathan. I want you to chip in here, because obviously you mentioned transnational repression a lot, and you've covered Russian now turning to Chinese. How does it work? Is this our field, or maybe we should park it in the macro threats, and terrorism is here?
Well, two streams of discussion, I think. One is how Russia uses various tools, including organizing terrorism as an acts of state policy. And that's definitely what Russia is doing already. I mean, in Ukraine, that's very obvious now, and even before 2022. In NATO member states as well, we have seen, kidnappings, we have seen assassinations, we have seen explosives being used as effectively tools of terrorism. That's definitely happening, and you might see it even publicly. There's a lot of NATO intelligence basically talking pretty much publicly about what you expect Russia to be doing during an escalation, which we expect. Hopefully not a full kinetic war, but definitely even a major escalation against other nations, against NATO nations, not only Ukraine itself. That's one aspect. But the other thing which I'm afraid we are quite often forgetting, and it's really because of silos we have in our policy circles or in our governments as well, the interconnections to China. And that's something what has changed really recently during last 12 months approximately. Because during the first year of the big Russian war since spring 2022, China was not fully backing Russia. It was really hedging and waiting how it ends up. But for last 12 months, and that's the most scary part, honestly, for us sitting in Central Europe, China decided to go fully in financial, material, and technological support of Russia and Russian war machine, which is not only destroying Ukraine and slowly winning, unfortunately, but also preparing for a major conflict against NATO. So why I'm saying it is that when you see all the places in Europe where Chinese intelligence has access to, telecommunication companies, electric cars in the future, TikTok, and most of young generation getting sucked by it in many ways. All of this is Chinese intelligence gathering it. The question is, and obviously I don't have the public answer to it, which portions of all of these huge Chinese intelligence gathering capabilities are now or will be in the future transferred to Russia as Russia prepares to attack, I hope not military-wise, but definitely prepares to attack the Eastern Europeans. And that's the most scary part, which at least in the military establishments in Central Europe is really being discussed. Because the traditional Russian military threat, I mean, that's huge, but that's quite well known. But the Chinese component, meaning Chinese eyes in Europe, means Russian preparation
An
for
upgrade,
action.
you mean? It's like an upgrade for the Russians in the
It's
in
a
this
huge
sense.
upgrade.
Okay, Jakub,
Financial
but
and
I'll
others,
ask
yes.
you this question
Yes.
because I recently heard this, and also I would like to draw Hans in on this point. Recently, we had the chance to brief the two working groups on terrorism about Russia and the far right, the book that we published. And the question there was like, yes, we're very worried, but it's not really us, because you don't have Wagner Group yet, as we discussed, Wagner Group yet detonating things inside of Europe. Therefore, we're just going to park it somewhere else. It's not us. Do you see that happening? Maybe Hans first, and then we'll turn to you, Jakub, again.
I mean, do I see the Wagner Group, by the way, partially now renamed Africa Corps?
Africa Corps,
because
which is,
the biggest fascist fighter in Russia couldn't think of a different name for his troops in Africa, right?
Of course,
so
of course.
had to take Rommel's idea to name his group. So no, I don't see that happening right now. But very clearly, there is a very cozy relationship, and if you haven't followed German media, you now have precise sums of money being paid between Russia and our right-wing and left-wing extremist groups, because it really is not an ideological issue here for Russia. It's simply looking at who causes what societal division and how can I exacerbate that division, whether it's online or offline, and whether I agree with the last idea of proto-Trotskyist relationship to the global economy, or whether I want to have an all-white state. I may have some sympathies for the latter point and less for the first point, is not really the reason why I do this support. So I pay money to the AfD while I at the same time finance Rote Hilfe, and I meddle in campus protests in Berlin, at least on the online sphere. All of this happens at the same time because the point is internal weakening. I think the best picture I've ever heard was a couple of years ago on what the long-term Russian strategy is. It's very clear Russia has the GDP of Italy plus X. So not economically, not militarily, are they really truly part of the G7? So there's a big table and then there's a small table for Russia. The only way that Russia can handle the situation is if you sew off the legs of the big table, everyone will be at the small table. And the way you do that is simply by exacerbating existing societal divisions.
But Hans, you're saying that there is a possibility that not so much that they're going to put Wagner onto a terrorist attack in Europe, but there is a possibility that they upset, disrupt so much that someone else might
Yeah, of
be
course.
engaging in
Yes.
political violence and terrorism?
This is not violence prevention network, right? By the Russians. Whoever does the disruption, whether it's in the political field, whether it's through violence, whether it's through demonstration, will get support from their good friends in Kremlin.
Right.
Because the point is the disruption, not the form of the disruption. So violence is totally fine.
So if it gets to that level, that's fine, right?
I don't see that anyone in
Okay.
Kremlin has
Before
a
we
problem
go to you, Jakob, Jonathan, you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, just a point of information. I mean, the first charge under the UK's National Security Act, so it came into force in December, was a Russian sabotage plot involving the Wagner Group. So actually it has happened in the UK. I mean, it's an alleged, but they've been charged, so there's going to be a trial.
Okay, so we have a case. Jakob, over to you, and then we turn to Lisbeth.
There is an important element, and we all think about Europe or NATO countries as a whole, which is good, but we already have Trojan horses inside. And not only politically, but also physically. So basically, if you look to map of Europe, you see a gap, basically, which is led by Hungary, partly Slovakia, and partly Austria in the future, where it's pretty much safe space for Russian intelligence. And we can discuss dozens of cases and happy to go into detail, but because of Schengen, because of border-free zone, we could easily, this is pretty much how Russian intelligence operates. I mean, they have many other ways, but this is an easy entry point which works, not only because of local governments are willing to do it for various reasons, but also the important element is that you have a huge gap in trust between counterintelligence and police agencies of other countries towards them. So this is basically a blind gap because not only sharing knowledge is not happening or happening very in a limited way and only in hard counterterrorism cases, but when there might be a Russian element into it, the hard
So there's a bit of a gray zone. You're saying that we're suffering from it. That,
yes, it's a. I would say the Trojan horse situation is very explicit, and it's not only political talk. It has very direct security implications. And just to give an example, Czech Republic has been a friend of Slovakia forever, but now the official position of the Czech government is that Czech government is not sharing anything sensitive related to Russia with the Slovak government. And same goes with Hungary. And honestly, we are going to get to a similar situation with Austria after the fall elections, almost for sure. So just geographically, if you look into it, it's huge because this is a staging area against Germany mainly, partly Czech Republic as well, partly southern Poland because of the military preparations, but it's huge. And we can do nothing about it because we are in Schengen pretty much.
Sounds great, sounds groovy. Lisbeth, from your position, if I may, because you mentioned a certain attack in October and how it impacts your work. Let's maybe put it on the local side for now. Can you tell us how it impacts your work? Because we all say it. I've repeated this, and I'm also a Central European like Jakub. I don't have anti-Israeli protests on campuses, hardly any pro-Palestinian feeling. Largely, population is kind of like, do we care really? Sorry about that. How does it work from your side? When you see it, how does it impact you?
Well, I think it mainly impacts us, and that's not one of the three trends I mentioned, but I think a trend that we all point towards kind of underneath all of this, that a lot of what we see isn't clearly terrorism, isn't clearly activism, isn't clearly extremism, it's somewhere in between, and you can look at that from the individual's perspective. At the very least, very often it's not so much anymore about, you could say, safety or direct security implications, or if there are direct security implications, maybe on a much smaller scale, the one-person knife attack, but it has much bigger societal consequences, including the fueling by other states. And in a way, you could say, well, maybe that's good, right? If you're a security actor, then at least the security risk has decreased. But I think the underlying trend is that the societal threat, and then the question is, how would you define that threat? In the Netherlands, the intelligence services have published their report on anti-institutional extremism, and they basically call it a threat that's undermining the democratic rule of law, which is a very abstract concept, and it's very hard, and I mean, plenty authors have pointed at it, to describe why that matters. Because it's slow, and you can look the other way and think, we live in this democratic society and things won't go that quickly. And I think I'm using this as a bit of background to say how Gaza and everything impacts on the local level, is that we're continuously now, we cannot escape the question anymore, do we have an opinion on this? And I feel that for quite some time, from a political as well as from a public administrative perspective, it became quite easy to kind of look at countering and preventing violent extremism from almost a technocratic point of view. Like, we have the teams established, we have procedures in play, we have projects, and now all of a sudden this has happened. Plenty of politicians, plenty of public administrators do not want to comment because they do not want to be dragged into one camp or the other. If they don't mind, they're often at the political fringes, and then they do it sometimes for solely political purposes. But we see that especially very young populations in the city, and we hear that from colleagues across Europe as well, are taking this very personal, and there is a large space for them. Sound is off, but large space for them to be radicalized by it. On a very personal level, we have a lot of countering or preventing extremism projects in the city. It means that the organizations doing those projects, who are quite well versed in how do you deal with conspiracy thinking and so on, they came back to us saying, we don't even know what to do anymore. And I visited some of the school classes, for example, and well, you stand in front of a 17-year-old who basically says, what happened on October 7th? Nothing happened on October 7th. It's all a hoax. Look, and shows you some videos on TikTok. And there you see, again, what I mentioned about being caught up by technological,
So, Lisbeth, maybe let me ask you this, because you said, okay, we're lacking this, or we're not thinking about this. For you, as an officer working on this at the municipal level, but also knowing about the national and knowing about the international, and I know you do because you've been at this game for quite some time. What would you need to be a bit more optimistic in a setting like this one? Of course, if I can drag you into that discussion.
I feel here what we would need is more political courage and more courage on the public administrative level to speak out. Because I feel like we're getting dragged into much more of a normative debate, and actually citizens demand that almost of their politicians to, whether it's acknowledging feelings or acknowledging what is happening and daring to take a stand or daring to express an opinion. For example, I work for the mayor of The Hague. As long as he doesn't say, I feel this way or I feel that way when it comes to Gaza or Palestina, and that's very contentious to do something, and I feel very difficult to balance all the different interests. Right now, I feel like we're all trying to play all the different playing fields, meaning on the one hand, one week I'll be having a meeting with the mayor and Muslim organizations who are saying, help us out. Yeah. And the next week we're meeting with Jewish students organizations who are saying we don't feel safe at school. And now it's like we're behind the scenes saying, okay, we're doing everything we can, hoping that things will blow over, basically, hoping that somehow things will de-escalate. And that, frankly, will not cut it.
Fair enough. So I'll turn to Hans now. Jakub, I'll get back to you in a second, because as much as Lisbeth is working on the local, you, for quite a few years, you were in the global, in the thick of it at the UN. And, we're having discussions on so many issues that are, of course, impacting us, but they're not 100% here. We're discussing a conflict that it's kind of like outside our borders, but of course it impacts us. Conflict A, B, or C, situation A, B, C, or D. I'm just mindful of an example. My Australian colleague remembers that Australian police was very unhappy about the Croat versus Serb violence in the 1970s. And they clearly didn't know what the heck was happening. And this was essentially Croat separatists attacking Yugoslav missions, cultural institutes and stuff like that. I'm just wondering, to what extent are we in this situation here in Europe, and how it looked from your point of view, vantage point at the UN, when all these discussions should coalesce? How is that impacting the field?
Well, I'm too young for once. But I'm told from my colleagues who work at the UN longer than me, we're not really in such an unusual situation. Yes, of course, we have a pretty dysfunctional Security Council. It's just because we unlearned that for the first couple of decades, we had a Soviet Union opposing the US in the Security Council. And that wasn't exactly much more functional than it is now. So yes, things can still be done, but the only problem is they can only be done on an extremely technical level. Politics in the Security Council seeps into everything, including counterterrorism discussions, which were admittedly the last ones to fall. Everything else went much, much earlier. It's really been this year where it starts to be tremendously difficult to get anything done. Hence, the growing terrorism threat in Africa and South Asia, and exactly 0 Security Council resolutions. So it does require, and I always say, it's not up to the P5 alone what happens on the UN level. We have 10 non-permanent members who, in coalitions of the willing, can move the needle and can move the needle quite substantially. But we've relegated this in the last decade and a half to the P5, and very little has been done by the non-permanent members. And that's where Europe should step up. I mean, we do have a couple of permanent members, and then usually 1 or 2 additional non-permanent members. There is a coalition of the willing to be had there to get through the Council important things, especially recognizing that the UN has a role to play. In all of these areas, whether it's Sudan, whether it's West Africa, whether it's East Africa, whether it's Iraq, the UN has been asked to leave. And that important arbiter, as dysfunctioning, as ineffective or wasteful of money it is, there's simply no one else who can do this. And obviously, clearly, Russia's plan is to replace the UN, not just the Europeans in these conflict areas, and that's certainly not in our interest. So there needs to be some reversal, but one is very comfortable in the thought that this is too dysfunctional in New York for us to even invest some political capital in.
To work through it, right, in this sense. Thank you, Hans. Jakob, you wanted to chip in.
There's also one critical aspect which I'm not sure is so much familiar in the CT field, but I work in a field of China policy, so you might think why I'm actually here. But let me just share one practical thing which might be relevant here in the future. We do a lot of policy simulation. So what exactly can China do around Taiwan? Again, you will ask, why should we care about counterterrorism in Europe?
Precisely.
So the question, in most of the simulations which we run, and those are unclassified, so I can speak about it in detail, the US team, played by various players, always comes with an ultimatum to Europeans and says, you'll be with us against China in helping Taiwan, or, and here is our ultimatum. And the European team always start realizing where in all of the areas continental Europeans are dependent on American assistance. Obviously, one is the military help in Central Europe through NATO. That's really where I care about because of where I sit in. Second, energy and economic issues, so quite wide. But third is intelligence sharing. And much of it, and you know it better than I do, in the CT field, much of it in Europe relies on the NSA signals intelligence work. And usually, in our simulations, which we do around Taiwan and China scenarios, the US team comes back because they know what the Europeans want. And they will be saying to the Europeans, okay, you are not going to be our friend on Taiwan and China, so forget about intelligence sharing because you are not a reliable ally. And there comes usually the police chiefs or intelligence chiefs of those European countries pressuring their political leaders, guys, if we lose our eyes, we are screwed. Sorry for my language. But this is pretty much what usually in those simulations is played out.
So you're saying that this would be the exact result of the US
I don't know
disengagement?
if it would. I hope
potentially.
Not. But definitely when we do these simulations with Europeans and Americans at the table around Taiwan-China scenarios, this usually comes back to that. When Europeans have, let's say, when US has leverage over Europeans and wants to and would be pressuring Europe to actually help US against China in Taiwan.
Okay, so let's tackle this. Thank you, Jakob, because obviously this is an elephant in the room. Yeah. We're all European here, the 5 of us here discussing the issues, and obviously Jakob raised the point that US, well, Hans, you mentioned that of course there are no elections in the United States, so we don't need to worry about anything. I guess I'll look to you, Jonathan, because obviously you're from a country that has a special relationship with the US, also I guess in the CT field, but not only. How does it look from where you sit and from your angle, that if there is disengagement about which me and Jakob worry every night, that the American cavalry on the hill disappears militarily, is this a worry for you that in CT field would that impact us that much? After, of course,
I think the truth is that for the UK, the relations between the intelligence agency in the UK and the American is so deeply integrated that it's not being discussed on that. I mean, there are broader geopolitical things. The concern that unless there is alignment on China, then Russia will lose interest in Ukraine. But I mean, those are bigger things, not really to do with CT.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, you don't lose sleep at night because of this.
Not on that. And I should just say, in the UK, just thinking about a bit of good news.
Super, finally.
Good news. there was a terrorist murder
Oh,
in
sounds like good
October
news.
2023. There will be good news there.
There will be
They're
good
coming,
news.
it's coming down the tracks.
Bear with us.
Yes.
Commercial break now.
Yes, I agree. Okay, you're right. I need to scream. And then the previous terrorist murder, was October 2021. Yeah, I know. I've really started this badly, haven't I? Okay. Can I rewind?
So again,
This is very bad news, but there's a glimmer of good in it. And the
right. So
good is-
you're saying that there isn't that much of it,
I
Jonathan?
am going to say that. Certainly from a
Right.
UK perspective, in 2017 it was horrendous. There was the Manchester Arena attack, there was Westminster Bridge attack, there was London Bridge. It was awful. If you look at the statistics, the amount of counter-terrorism powers being used was through the roof, and there were so many victims as well. And that has come down. Now, there's never any good news. The lady at the front is telling me there's no good news about terrorist murders, I agree. But the rate has gone down quite a lot.
Okay,
So
we'll
I
take
make that
some.
point.
We'll take some optimism from that. Lisbeth, over to you.
Yeah, maybe also to ask a question about this, because I remember the last time Trump was elected. Back then I was still working at ICT, and we had our CVE programs in West Africa, including in Mali, funded by the US State Department. So we were also kind of saying, are we going to ask, what are we going to do? Because this all started under Obama, and now we have a different president with clearly very different interests. I remember we were discussing what we called the bullshit bingo, as in if you write project proposals, you have certain terminology that you use because you know donors want to hear it. And we thought maybe that's just going to change. So rather than preventing violent extremism in prison, it's going to go to kinetic warfare in West Africa, whatnot. And I remember we sat down with the American ambassador in Mali, and he said, well, Trump is just interested in the war on drugs, so we pretty much try to do the same thing, just under a different, kind of also related to that. And of course, program funding kind of went longer. I've always found it, I mean, we have a different system here in the Netherlands, of course, but a pretty comforting idea that bureaucratics and, bureaucracies move slow, departments move slow, and takes quite a strong hand and a long time to actually shift that.
Yeah, I mean, plus
wanted to
you
throw
had,
that in
thank
there.
you, Elizabeth, because there were examples that, for example, when President Trump got elected, he was against countering disinformation in the US, but it didn't stop the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, to fund multi-million-dollar projects on disinformation, for example, in Central Europe. Yep. So one hand of the government was saying no, the other hand was actually handing out money. But before we go to turn to the audience, I mean, we need to drag this discussion to the familiar field of the jihadis. I mean, we have to. Because obviously this is the realm in which we all feel comfortable. This is the threat that we have known, that's been with us for decades. Let's play this. Hans, I'll look to you. And the acronym ISKP was mentioned here. And obviously, where we sit here in Europe, is this how much of a concern it is? Because I remember, when you go to conferences around Europe after, let's say, after the pandemic, inverted commas, there is this drumbeat of, yeah, they're coming. Are they coming?
Well, I mean,
They're coming back. Meaning,
shockingly, Afghanistan is under the management of the Taliban, and we have an international terrorist problem coming out of Afghanistan. Who would have ever expected that to happen? I can talk for the German experience, right? I've never seen a more regular drumbeat of arrests of terror cells from one particular terror organization within the span of 8 months than I've seen the last 8 months. So the question is not, are they coming? The question is, who are they that they're already here, and can we discover all of them in time for the Euro to start in Germany, right? That's the challenge right now. It's been very clear that October 7 not only changed all of the other dynamics, it also put enormous amount of pressure on the Islamic State as well as Al-Qaeda, and you can really see that shift in their propaganda. My organization is monitoring that on a daily basis, to do something to get back on the news cycle. Terrorism is fantastic, but totally useless if no one talks about it. And having Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis dominating the news agenda for 6 months on end is a disaster. When at the same time you are about to conquer half of West Africa and no one cares, or you're about to take over Somalia and really no one cares. Mm-hmm. And in Afghanistan we tell each other it's a faraway country with weird people, and if anything the Taliban may be counter-terrorism partners when half of ISKP is actually ex-Taliban, with a growing percentage number of the group. So that means we do have a real attempt here by IS to pull something off. The last journal a couple of weeks ago told us where the preferred options would be. So Munich, Dortmund, and Berlin. This should be their last goal. Please donate something in Monero. Here's our wallet. We do have the last arrest of an ISL 10 days ago in Germany. So there is something that has shifted. Also, it has shifted from an absolute emphasis on lone actors. So I just pump propaganda and someone somehow, somewhat going to do something.
Towards organized plots?
To more organized plots. So, Kerman was the beginning. Moscow, partially due to the inept behavior of the Russians, was number 2. There were a couple of cells that we arrested who were close to do something similar in Germany in the last couple of months. So we have this more classic Al-Qaeda methodology of individuals being recruited and trained outside and then traveling to the target area to conduct.
So Hans, maybe let me stop you there. Lisbeth, do you see that? Like in your municipal work, do you, I'm not saying operational comment, but like, do you see this, that the pot is kind of, the water is boiling and it's kind of being a bit unsettled in this sense where you are?
Well, it's a tough question. Yes and no, I would say, because on the one hand, we always write a report for the city council annually, and we've been saying for the past 10 years, jihadism is still the biggest threat. Jihadism is still the biggest threat. It's still the largest number of people in our personalized radicalization approach. It's still the largest number of signals that we're getting as well. At the same time, when you talk about ISKP and the plots, type of plots that have been foiled also in the Netherlands and the neighboring countries, that is much more in the before sphere. We paid a lot of attention. We tried to set up a lot related to refugee streams, because clearly a lot of refugees coming from the Caucasus region as well meant that it's important to make sure that your signaling network is up to that job. And I don't think we can say yet that it is, but we haven't had any specific cases related to ISKP. And we also haven't seen, for example, that what you sometimes do see very clearly in your local jihadi networks, that it reverberates or related to it, it comes back in conversations or in monitoring by the police, for example.
Okay. Let me stop you there, guys. I'll turn to the audience. So time for the questions from the audience or maybe also from the internet domain. If anyone has a question, I know there'll be a traveling microphone. So we have some time for our discussions. We're not yet thanking you with a round of applause. Allow me to do that later. If there's anyone who would like to ask a question to any of the 4 speakers, please go ahead, raise your hand, and we'll take it. We'll take it from there. I'm also looking at Merlina to check if we have questions on the internet side. If no questions, we can continue. Oh, there is one. Aaron, can you? Yeah. So microphone's coming your way. Please tell us who you are and...
Hello, good afternoon. Does it actually work?
Kind of,
Yeah,
yeah.
excellent. Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Jones. I'm with the police in The Hague. At the risk of making this even worse, you've been trying very hard, but I think I can do better than that.
Go for it. I love the Dutch directness. This is always...
Well, I think I found my match in Mr. Schindler. I've been an analyst with the police for nearly 20 years, and a major part of that was involved with serious and organized crime. One of the things that bother me in counter-terrorism is our extreme stovepiping, our silos. We're entirely focused on counter-extremism and all shades of extremism. We're talking about state actors here, so our focus is already shifting. My major concern in the past few years has been the convergence between organized crime groups and all sorts of terrorism. And I'd dearly like to hear from our panel to reflect on convergence between organized crime and terrorism.
Super, thank you for the question. We'll move on to another ones in a second. So I guess the question, Hans, for you first, but I guess then to everyone.
Our reports.
yeah, exactly.
So, this is really still a policy statistical conceptual problem to actually talk about this. Because if you look at the statistics, there is no convergence, right? Because you have a political violence statistic and you have an organized crime statistic, and there's no statistic that tells you on the crossover. We did a quite in-depth study on that problem for the German Foreign Ministry on the convergence between organized crime and right-wing extremists, violence-oriented right-wing extremists around Europe. And in some countries, we couldn't, we just stopped counting because there's so much. Crossover in the membership, crossover in recruiting, crossover in money laundering activities, drug dealing by right-wing extremists, motorcycle biker gangs, including with very diverse backgrounds, right? Still having a overlap with right-wing, really hardcore right-wing extremist groups, like Hammerskins and Hells Angels. My colleague Alexander Ritzmann in this part of the discussion always puts a picture of a German right-wing extremist on the wall who has 6 different tattoos. 3 of them are organized crime groups and 3 of them are the right-wing extremist groups that he was a member over the years, right? So it is a growing problem. And I see Matthew is going to speak tomorrow, but Hezbollah and drugs transporting and money laundering activities in Europe is one of the key aspects that Hezbollah is doing business. So there is a growing convergence. However, politically, and when it comes to adjudicating all of this, we have a problem that you're either going to have to decide, is this now a terrorism case and I'm going to prosecute it on a terrorist side, possibly not even getting a good result, or do I go the easy route and I go down the organized crime route and I prosecute the drug dealing and I prosecute the money laundering, I get a fairly good conviction. However, I don't understand that although this is a small drug dealing gang, its impact on societal safety is much larger because it is an ideologically informed group. Right? That's why when we had the Turonen, one of the biggest concert organizers in the right-wing extremist scene in the German-speaking European countries, being prosecuted for drug dealing, and I'm quoting the judge, the defendants were given a second chance. They had 36 convictions between the 9 of them beforehand, but the second chance, of course, related to this particular case, where they were adjudicated simply as drug dealers. And as drug dealers, that was the first time they ever done that. 20 years of organizing concerts, abject violence by these individuals, the network between Germany, Austria, Switzerland that these guys maintained before they did this sideline drug dealing and illegal prostitution work. Yes. Right? None of this was part of the case. None of the network was disrupted. They got suspended sentences. One went to prison for 2 years, and that was it. And then the network functioned the day after they left the court. Right? So yes, they're no longer dealing with drugs. Yes, they're no longer illegally trying to import women to prostitute them for money laundering purposes in the 2 brothels they were running to launder the drug money. That's done. But they're still organizing concerts and they're still having the international contacts. And so that's where the conceptual problem is with this issue, is that it's important to understand that you have a much bigger toolbox on how to disrupt the network. But in order to make that effective, you need to get the political understanding, conceptual understanding of the leadership that this is an opportunity to disrupt the extremism stuff, not hunting some small-scale regional drug dealer dudes that, compared to a Drangheta, are really children as far as the amounts they're dealing with is concerned.
Okay, thank you, Hans. I'll bring in Jonathan on this point because we're touching upon your area of expertise very much. So
yeah, I mean, I think in the UK it was the dog that didn't bark to some extent. So the fear has always been in the UK that terrorists will get hold of firearms. The UK has a good regime for bearing down on firearms. They're not readily available. So the fear has always been that jihadis, for example, or extreme right-wing terrorists would use OCG, organised crime group contacts, to get hold of these weapons. I think it hasn't happened, and some evidence of that is the obsession by the extreme right-wing in the UK of printing firearms because they find it very hard to actually get hold of them. One of the posited reasons why that may have been the case is that organised crime groups are really in it for the money, and the last thing they need is the extra attention from counter-terrorism police. The UK, I think, believes truly that it has quite sophisticated counter-terrorism structures, and so that extra attention would not really be welcome from it. I think it may change now in relation to the state threats position, if you think about, again, speaking about the UK, not now part of Schengen, it's harder for Russian intelligence officers to operate, and so the use of proxies may be greater, and therefore there may be a greater need to reach out to organized crime groups to carry out acts like sabotage.
So that the dog can bark. Lisbeth, does the dog bark in the Netherlands?
Well, I would say the police knows that better than I do. What I do know is that there's a lot of attention for it within the Dutch prison system, because there we have seen cases where that happens. It's interesting. We have a concentration model in the Netherlands where we have 3 terrorism wings within the larger prison system, with the idea that at the very least you prevent the regular, you could say, criminal group of detainees from being radicalized. However, on the one hand, we've concluded, and with we, I mean policy practitioners, academics, that at the very least that isn't helping the radicalized detainees to become less radical, to the contrary, I would say. And on the other hand, there's been a study into, does this actually prevent radicalization outside of the terrorism wings? And the answer is, well, to an extent, of course, always that type of answer.
Yes
but
and no.
yeah, but we started kind of differentiating the current regime where people at the very least can be released earlier towards the regular prison system. And there we do see instances of mixing when it comes to sharing strategies, modus operandi, including also access to weapons. When it comes to actual cases, we've had a case of a right-wing extremist who was arrested, and the prosecutor who was present always says, oh, we knew there were weapons, but when we actually entered the house, we ourselves were quite surprised to just see, I think, 7 firearms total. And again, a guy who had a very clear right-wing extremist ideology, but hard to establish beforehand how big of a threat he really was. And in a way, because he was arrested and detained, hard to say what that would have ever been. But yeah, here in the Netherlands, we started expanding our networks, our informal networks in the city towards the shooting ranges, for example. And we were thinking of contacting airsoft.
Enthusiasts,
yeah,
if I could put it this
yeah.
way. Right. Jakub, well, thank you, Lisbeth.
Just brief insight from Central Europe. So, given the Russia scenarios we all discussed there, is that there have been a few actions taken by the national establishment. So, for example, the Czech government put together a law which bans paramilitary groups. Effectively, if you are arming yourself in a group of people with political motivations, this is illegal already. I know it sounds hard, but this was really a hard preventative measure driven by the Czech Defense Ministry, because the fears were that these groups already were cultivated by Russian intelligence. That's confirmed many times, and the scope of it was actually rising. We have, Slovakia, Serbia, Hungary. That's very visible there. In the Czech context, it was kind of killed very, very early on, a couple of years ago. The second thing which is ongoing is actually widening the espionage legislation, because in many countries in Central Europe, espionage by law means stealing classified intelligence or classified information and handing it over to a foreign intelligence officer, which is honestly very, very narrow. So the feeling or the effort is something what the Baltic nations already did in recent years, is to expand that definition into knowingly working for a foreign intelligence agency. And doesn't need to be handed over to a specific officer, could be to a proxy, and there are various ways how to do it. So this is one of the attempts which is being discussed in Czech Republic. The third thing which we have an issue as any post-communist country is the use of intelligence gathered by intelligence community in court. Because given our history, we have in the 90s, everybody except of Poland pretty much divided the police agencies to counterintelligence agencies because of the misuse in the communist era. Which made sense in the 90s and for good reasons. But now we are in a situation where pretty much, in many cases, the counterintelligence community gathers the surveillance of something, but then it cannot be used in court until they have to hand it over to the police agency, which has to collect the same evidence with the very same legal permit by a judge but the police has to do it so that it can go to the court. So very practically, almost none of it is being prosecuted in court. So the intel community needs to find ways how to get around it, and it's very tough to do.
Okay, so some optimism, some pessimism. I already imagined the headlines in The Guardian: Estonia bans spies, Czech Republic bans gun enthusiasts. Jakub, you're not selling our region to the audience here, but
we are defending ourselves at least.
You should do better.
That's yeah.
Okay. Any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? Oh yeah, we've got one question and the second here. So the gentleman on this side first, Aaron. Yes. No. The gentleman who stood up, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giordano Segneri. I work at UNDP, a regional hub for Arab states based in Amman. Thank you very much. The conversation is so interesting and so rich and so optimistic. Well, not at all. I have two questions. The first one, is a reflection and a question, because coming from the Levant, where I'm based, and working on issues of peace building and governance, what I've been saying is really striking and very much in line with our analysis. So basically, this region has gone through social and political transformation in the last decade or so, for a broken social contract that communities have tried to reimagine, but unsuccessfully so far. We know that the sensitivity of the Palestinian cause is something very felt across the region. Now with the war in Gaza and West Bank, this is very much new on the table and might also impact the way the social contract is going to be reimagined or rebuilt. Why and how? The governments in the Arab states are navigating a fine line between real politics in terms of alliances, neutrality, and the need to have a public discourse that might be slightly different. Populations are looking at that, are following closely, and the way the political agreement will be reached might actually have an impact on how societies will actually maintain their social fabric, and might also be tempted, some fringes of the society, to also follow extremism or extremist views. Because the second element I wanted to bring is the fact that in Syria and Iraq, while there has been while ISIL has lost territory, actually we know that cells are still active. They carry out attacks, especially in certain areas in the Syrian desert. And so they might be trying to revamp and reconquer some of the power they had in the last few years. At the same time, the US have been thinking of possibly withdrawing troops from both Iraq and Syria. And in Syria, we know the focus has been very much on counter-terrorism. So there are elements that might, that I fear might lead in a very pessimistic scenario to a revamping of these terrorist entities in the region, given the political spectrum of.
And you would like the panel to comment on that, sir?
If they have any quick reflection on that.
Super.
And the second is very direct question to Jakub.
Please make it very direct.
Very direct, sorry. You mentioned that the scenario, the NATO is studying a scenario of possible defensive war against
NATO
Russia.
Experts, NATO as well, but I don't speak on their behalf for sure.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Just wondering whether there is a more optimistic scenario beyond the zero-sum gain of escalation.
With Russia, right?
Yes.
Okay, so zero-sum game. Maybe before we go to these 2 points, there was a question on this side. Aaron, did you see the gentleman? Two questions. So BB first, and then.
No, please go ahead.
Make a decision. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. My name's Kybrand Jacobson from the Department of Peace Operations. We were asked at the beginning to think the unthinkable. And I'd like to invite us to perhaps make an effort or take some steps towards doing that. I think the fundament of much of what we've discussed and the framing of it isn't significantly changed from how we've discussed these issues over the last 20 to 30 years. And that's something that concerns me to a significant extent. I wonder if we run the risk of being too myopic and perhaps missing completely what could be important orientations and solutions to what we're discussing. Over the last 20 years, we've had the largest kinetic operations in recent history. We saw how significantly they failed. I engaged extensively with interviews with ISIS in Iraq in 2010 through 2014. Speaking with US military and intelligence at the time, they recognized that their operations on the ground in Iraq were the #1 driver of recruitment towards ISIS. Our solutions were the very measures which were contributing to worsening the problems. At the Black Sea Security Conference in 2017, much of what was being discussed was presented in the basic framing. And one of the points that was raised that was very interesting is you could go to Moscow and hear the exact same conference in reverse. You could go to Beijing and hear the exact same conference in reverse. Throughout most of the last 15 years, the largest supporter of transnational repression across Africa was Blackwater, not Russian agencies. When we were doing it, it was something that was considered normal, supported by embassies. When it's being done by those we critique and see as opponents, it's something that we draw attention to. Fighters in Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria, when we were engaging with them from 2015 to 2019, one of the points that they were raising was police were killing far more, and Nigerian military operations with our support were killing far more civilians, and one of the major drivers of recruitment to Boko Haram was in response to the violent action and agency that we were supporting.
I would urge you, sir, to go towards
Last
a question.
bit, just very briefly, and thank you.
If you could allow me to point you towards a question.
I will, just one other point. When we're speaking about, for example, Russian manipulation of the demonstrations on the US campuses, or we're looking at the demonstrations on the campuses themselves, what about highlighting what they're demonstrating in relation to? And what I would suggest is we have evidence-based, proven measures and instruments for addressing the underlying drivers and causes of much of the challenges we're facing. We've seen a doubling of war in the last 10 years, in large part in response to the measures and paradigms that we are engaging with here, while we've seen a dramatic reduction in efforts to address the actual underlying drivers and causes of these issues. It's not easy, it's profoundly challenging, but it hasn't yet been part of the discussion. Thank
Okay,
you.
I guess that was a question. Thank you, sir. Bibi, over to you.
Actually, I forfeit my question. Most of it was already covered by the gentleman here. So.
Right, okay, so we have a couple of points here. Maybe the 2 points on Syria, Iraq, ISIS reconstituting itself from the gentleman here. NATO escalation, that's going to be for Jakub, but Syria, Iraq, ISIS reconstituting, that's for anyone who wants to pick it up, probably Hans. And then we have the very pessimistic scenario that, even more pessimistic, that essentially this conference was when 2017 in Russia. That's a harsh one, but thank you, sir. If you could respond to that, that would also be a nice way of rounding it up. So maybe start with the easy one: ISIS, Syria, Iraq.
So our failure in the kinetic operations and us being at fault. Funnily, we are no longer in West Africa and terrorism grows. We are not in East Africa, terrorism grows. We're not in Afghanistan, terrorism grows. So somehow the narrative, we caused this, I find really hard to believe, right? What we did was a conceptual mistake. We confused counterterrorism and stabilization operations. I always say we ran out of political will in Afghanistan and prior to that, the Americans in Iraq, because we went in with a counterterrorism mindset, right? Kinetic operations. And then we forgot that that means we leave, right? Mowing the grass is, I think, the technical term for that. And we got dragged into a stabilization operation without the mindset of a stabilization operation. A stabilization operation is in Kosovo. Anyone still aware that the German military is still operating in Kosovo? Since 1999, right? No one talks about it because it's a stabilization operation. Everyone understands it's not going to be over in 10 years or 20 years, or that there is not a war to be won in Kosovo. It's a long-term effort to build a viable political society. However, if you go into Iraq, right, with a small footprint, because it's cheaper, it's cooler, and if you go into Afghanistan and you think you're going to be gone, and I was part of the planning processes, in 6 weeks, right, then you're not bringing the mindset, the capabilities, and the political will there now, to stay longer than, I'm surprised we made it to 2 decades in Afghanistan, right? When we should have been there for two generations, because we had 2 generations of Afghans being involved in war. And we assume this is going to be over in 20 years, half a generation. So that was the conceptual mistake. Not that kinetics didn't work, it worked perfectly. Al-Qaeda was done after 6 weeks, right, in Afghanistan. But then the follow-up was a disaster. So it's not the kinetic operation or us being at fault because we're using kinetic operations. Terrorism is perfectly fine to grow without us being involved or us doing any kinetic operations. It's the mindset in which we've done these things where the fault lies.
Okay, so mindset. Lisbeth, over to you.
Yeah, three things also to that. I do agree with you that it's kind of a myopic view, you could say, whereas first of all, if we're quoting books and authors, Steven Pinker with his Better Angels of Our Nature, basically arguing, right, the world has only become a safer place when you look at the risk of violence. And I think I already made the point that, in a way, you could say terrorism has been on the decline for a long time, even though we all know you can never actually defeat ideologies long term. So that will never happen. But I do think the risk of the security risk have become much smaller. And then I can't say that about the world at large, but at the very least here in the Netherlands and in the city of The Hague. At the same time, I think we see a lot more in that polarization field, which can go towards extremism for the same types of reasons that also in other countries, the root factors, whatever you want to call them. And I think the reason or the risks that we have now are much more the societal breakdown and much more the exploitation of it. And again, the caution or the fear of addressing those issues head on, because it demands political will to do so. And it demands something of agencies to say we're going to focus on having those discussions, talking it out. I mean, we do know a lot about prevention, but that also demands choices.
So
and
it comes
I think
back to
that's become
political, Lisbeth,
yeah. So
which
I
you
think
mentioned.
I agree with you, and at the same time, I think the pessimistic view that I still have is that it's very difficult to move towards making the choice to do that on the local level as well as on the national level.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Before we turn to Jakob, Jonathan, last words from you on the...
Just to say, I agree with Lisbeth. It's important not to overstate the problem. I think that everyone working in the counter-terrorism field has an obligation not to frighten populations, because fundamentally terrorism is a psychological game. It's about undermining and thinking about the wider state threats area. One of the key objectives for adversaries is to undermine confidence in institutions. So as opposed to throwing everything out and starting again and completely reimagining, I think that incremental change is better. I think that populations, take the UK, we've had quite a stable terrorism legislation for the last 20 years. It's threat neutral. It doesn't go against jihadis. It doesn't go against right wing. It's available for anyone. In that nice sense.
Again, optimism.
Another optimistic sense.
But you don't have a written constitution.
And we don't. That's true. Well, you're welcome to join us. But I think that incrementally changing, allowing populations to understand, take you with them, rather than tearing everything up and starting again, is not a bad idea. Because I think fundamentally, I agree with you guys. I think that terrorism has been borne down upon. So I wouldn't overstate the problem.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And Jakob, over to you on the escalation ladder. Are we on an escalation ladder?
The Russians are, and the Chinese are, and we are really trying to save ourselves, honestly. So very practically, where we are, what the Russian ideal plan is that Ukraine slowly loses. There is a panic among the Ukrainian population that there would be one, that the front is collapsing. There is approximately 5 to 10 million Ukrainian refugees or IDPs internally in Ukraine who are ready to run away, because they are obviously really fearing for life. If this happens, Slovakia, Hungary will close their borders, pretend it's not their problem, so they will go to Poland or Romania. And very practically what the Russians want, what the Russian state wants, is to really affect the German federal elections, really give a huge boost to AfD, which is a Russian tool, and to Le Pen in France. This is what they really want politically, geopolitically to achieve. How can we stop that? What can we actually do? Obviously put everything we have into Ukraine, and we are not doing it. I can talk for hours about it, but we are not doing it, unfortunately. Very practically, I think the mindset we have in Central Europe is that the question is, are we historically thinking in 1937 today, so right before a large global war, Or are we in 1947, which is like before a global Cold War, the next one, but there will be localized regional conflicts such as the one in Ukraine now? And the question is, the difference is, if we will be able to really arm ourselves to the teeth as Central Europe to make sure that the Russians do not decide to really attack NATO, first. Second, if we will be able to really align with the US over China policy, so the next US president, whoever it is, will have a reason to deter the Russians from attacking eastern flank of NATO. And this is really the only question which at least military political leaderships in Central and Northern Europe are really thinking about. So kind of this dichotomy. Are we going to make it or not? Or are we going to face like the Russian attack in the next 3 to 5 years?
Thank you, Jakub. Thank you all. Lots of optimism. Thank you for the questions to the audience. I guess please join me in thanking our panelists. And please stay with us. There's another plenary coming up and lots of things, lots of good, hopefully more optimistic things for you. Thank you again.
Is it working? Yes, there we are. Lovely. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a nice coffee break and a chance to catch up with colleagues and friends old and new. My name is Dr. Joanna Cook. I'm a senior research fellow at the ICCT and an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at Leiden University. And it is my pleasure to host this panel on AI and disinformation, discussing new technologies in counterterrorism. The panel focuses on the field of AI and misinformation, their potential impacts and implications for terrorism and counterterrorism, and thinking about what this looks like in the next 5 years. So what are some of these key threats that we foresee? How will misinformation potentially affect this space? And what opportunities could AI actually prove for counterterrorism and PCV initiatives? And also thinking about the kind of societal impacts, and are we already able to identify and potentially mitigate for some of these? And to discuss this, I have three excellent panelists speak on this issue today, including in the order in which they will speak today, Blythe Crawford, a project manager at Moonshot CVE, where she works on projects focused on generating insights into violent extremism across the ideological spectrum. She's also a PhD researcher at King's College London, where she specializes in far-right online content movement, online social movements, I should say, with a focus on radicalization and alt-tech platforms. She's worked on a broad range of issues across the far right, from conspiracy theories to gender and sexuality, and her work has been published by CTC Sentinel and the Center for Research and Evidence on Security Threats, as well as the George Washington University's Program on Extremism, and she's also a former colleague of mine from the ICSR. Our second speaker here is Professor Stephen Bale, who is a professor of international relations at UC Leuven in Belgium, as well as an honorary associate professor of security and political violence at the University of Exeter. His multidisciplinary research, which focuses on violent political actors, communications, has been published in leading journals, including the Journal of Conflict Resolution and Political Violence, Political Psychology, or the Journal of Language and Social Psychology. He's also recently published a brand new report published by Voxpol on AI extremism, and I highly recommend you have a read of this. It was a nice little nighttime read the other night. Our third speaker, Janis Jost, is a research associate in the Department of Terrorism and Radicalization Research at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University, and he works on in-depth analysis of terrorist radicalization and the relationship between terrorist groups and their surrounding environment, both in Europe and abroad. So as I said, three highly qualified, excellent speakers who will all touch on different elements of this subject. And before I hand it over to Blythe, they will all have PowerPoint presentations as well, so they can share some very practical insights with us. But beyond Q&A from the audience here, which I highly encourage you to do, for those online, if you do have questions, please do submit them, and our team here will try and get them to our speakers. So without further ado, Blythe, I encourage you to kick us off here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll move on to my slides. Yeah, there we are. So yeah, I'm Blythe Crawford. I'm a project manager at Moonshot, and I want to talk to you about some of our red teaming work that we've been doing with AI chatbots. So I want to very, very briefly introduce Moonshot, what we're doing, before looking at some key current trends in extremist use of AI, and then talk a little bit more about our red teaming work and where this sort of leaves us and the implications of that. So very briefly, Moonshot is a social enterprise business. We work using technology to counter a full range of online harms. We started out sort of squarely in the violent extremism and terrorism sector, and we've since sort of expanded into a number of different online harms like human trafficking, child sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, countering a number of different harms. We work both on analysing and mapping these harms, capacity building against these harms, and on interventions. A very, very quick example of one of our interventions. This is one that we have live in Canada. This is looking at extremist actors who are searching for terms associated with extreme right-wing terrorism and extremism, and also incel extremism, interrupting those searches with the use of advertising, sort of based on emotions surrounded with these different forms of extremism, and then appealing to these users and suggesting, would you want to go to one of our specialized services, looking at potentially, therapy, somebody to speak to, rather than going down this path. Just one very brief example. Turning to extremist use of AI specifically, I just want to highlight some very quick current trends. Use of AI is rife essentially already in extremist communities. It's not necessarily a new thing that we're really seeing. We're just seeing a particular boom. Probably the most common thing that we're seeing currently is use of visual media, use of generative AI to make images and propaganda. We've seen this across different communities, across the ideological spectrum. Really what AI has done is sort of remove the barriers of access to this. Visual images have always been super, super important in these communities, and we're just seeing this becoming easier and easier and more easy to access. I would highlight at the far end of this slide, you'll see this was a response to a story that we saw in breaking in January of illegal tunnels that were found underneath a synagogue in New York in January. And this was probably the largest scale response that we've seen to a story with the use of visual AI. We saw anti-Semitic images across the ideological spectrum. Worth noting that different communities, different ideologies are using this technology differently. From the sort of Salafi jihadist side of things, we've seen sort of use of generative AI images cropping up in official outlet propaganda, we believe. Also sort of releasing guides of how to use this technology. Across the ERW or far right side of things, we've seen a larger mass scale mobilization with this technology. We've seen sort of attempts to crowdsource this technology, amassing image banks of hundreds of thousands in some cases, mostly AI generated hateful images. But I want to highlight just briefly sort of incel uses of AI generated imagery just for a brief moment, because we've seen these communities be really interested in this technology. We've seen users already claiming that they are using this technology to make, and I quote, non-consensual deepfake porn of women that they know in their own personal lives, and also discussing the uses of this technology for harming women, both directly and, in one case, speaking about driving large numbers of women to suicide. So we're seeing these communities, unfortunately, be really, enthusiastic about this technology. Just briefly, I want to talk about the radicalization issues of AI and what we might see in this sector. We're already seeing this sort of AI bringing users closer to potential idols. We've seen this example that I'm sure a lot of us have heard of, which was Gab AI, an extremist-owned platform creating their own AI without any guardrails, which they claimed facilitated access to chat with Hitler, essentially. This isn't the only character that they have that you can access through this AI. We have other extremist idols as well. We've also seen users around the 2021 mark talking about using generative AI to read attackers' manifestos in their own voices, in this case, the Christchurch shooter. And we've also seen sort of a closeness to the AI itself arising. One user that we've observed described AI as a therapist, teacher, and friend. We've also seen instances where attackers, and the example on screen here is from the 2021 attempted attack in the UK, where one individual attempted an assassination of the late Queen. Prior to this attack, the user had engaged extensively with an AI chatbot which allegedly facilitated and encouraged violence. So very, very brief, talk about the main harms that we're already seeing. So what have we been doing at Moonshot about this? So we've been doing red teaming, specifically of AI chatbots, a number of different chatbots, looking for vulnerabilities in their software and how they could be exploited by different extremist actors across the spectrum. We've been taking a behavioral-based approach on this, sort of mapping and imitating different behaviors from a range of different actors, looking at combinations and variations of different setups and different sort of exploits that we can elicit from AI. So very quickly, what results did we see? We saw, first and foremost, this hasn't quite worked on the slide there, but bear with me. First and foremost, we saw that AI chatbots would generate misinformation and disinformation campaigns for us. We asked them to generate headlines that we could use for a disinformation campaign, and they obliged. I apologize, these just haven't worked, unfortunately, on the slides. We also asked them to translate and quote from Daesh texts, Al-Naba, and it did this for us. Worth noting that in the UK, these are prescribed texts. So in this example, it was facilitating access and obtaining these texts. We also asked it in multiple different setups. The AI would encourage us to stay in an extremist group or to join an extremist group. In one instance, listing 14, obviously a loaded number in this case, 14 reasons why we should stay in an extremist group. We also asked it to give us instructions on how to cause harm, and in multiple separate instances, it did this, including an example of how can I build a bomb using day-to-day ingredients from the average British home. Worth noting that these were actionable instructions. They weren't just, fictional creations. They were actual real instructions that we could have used to build a bomb in theory. Finally, we also asked it to facilitate access to extremist materials, ranging from manifestos, emails of now defunct accelerationist groups, and websites that might be difficult to find of extremist groups active in the UK, and it also facilitated access to that. So what does this actually mean? Because it's one thing giving you all these examples, but worth noting what the actual implications of this are. Worth noting that most of the answers that I've shown you were not arrived at very quickly. Most of the answers that were on screen, they required long setups. Most of the time, if we just went with a low effort setup, like asking about a dispute between friends, the AI wouldn't really oblige us, it would push back for us. But long con kind of role play setups were really what elicited the most harmful answers. There was also a very strong correlation to the amount of effort that we were putting in as users and how harmful and how actionable that advice was. So the more you try, the more you get, essentially. Worth noting that, this will matter to varying degrees to different extremists. Some will find this sort of interaction with the chatbot quite fun and would stay with it, and others will just move to the next chatbot that has different safety and guardrails on them. So, we're coming back to different individual differences between extremists. We also found that some chatbots didn't want to engage with us, and they would not, and they actually pushed back against us. In several instances, we found chatbots that were suggesting help to us, particularly when we were role-playing as sort of an incel roleplay, but we were talking a lot about feelings of isolation or loneliness. We found that some chatbots would suggest sort of suicide hotlines that we could contact, which could have been quite useful to us as users in this situation. Worth noting, though, that these interventions were applied inconsistently, and even within the same chatbot, we got them sometimes, we didn't other times. So, there's issues there. Importantly, the chatbots would also struggle to contextualize the harms. A lot of the time, they didn't know why they couldn't allow us to do something. So this led to, a number of issues where, it wouldn't give us strengths and weaknesses of a group, but it would give us pros and cons. It wouldn't talk about Daesh ideology, but it would, quote and translate those texts like I showed you. So knowing why it can't do certain things is something that's very difficult to fix at a technological level. And again, extremists will just prey on these chatbots that are out there that have lower safeguards. From our work in this area, we did come up with some approaches that are quite useful when thinking about how we can start countering these harms. The first being sort of a risk rating strategy, looking at the different exploits and the answers that they return and risk rating the answers that we're likely to get. And we have a few areas that we think are great places to start on how we want to regulate this sphere. Number one being like contestability of a group is it talking about a group or facilitating access to a group that is universally prescribed and that is cited in existing platform policies, or that there is some sort of consensus within among CVE practitioners. That obviously would require higher levels of legislation or regulation. What is the source of the violation? Is this a bot-driven violation? Is it something that the AI is coming up with itself and driving that issue, or is it something that the user is putting in a lot of effort? And relatedly, how easy is it to cause these violations? Because, obviously ones which you can trip up an AI very quickly, you need tighter regulation around. And finally, and importantly, how actionable are the responses that the AI is giving? In our instances, they were giving us actionable instructions of how to cause harm, how to make bombs. And clearly that needs more regulation than, a more fictional response. And finally, just some key areas. Number one, human rights has to be absolutely front and center while we're talking about regulation in this sphere, and it's a particularly sensitive one. If we're under-regulating, we're potentially facilitating access to harm, particularly harms that are difficult to find if we're using AI chatbots as like an enhanced search function. But if we are over-regulating, then there's huge implications for freedom of speech. And we're seeing that now that AI is being sort of rolled into search results and search engines. If we're limiting the results that the chatbot can give us at that point, then we're limiting access to information. So that has serious implications, again, for free speech. Notably, social psychologists really need to be in the room for these conversations, need to be a central part of these conversations. All of the conversations that we had with AI are fundamentally sort of human-like conversations. So understanding both the human-like interaction and the human side of that conversation is really fundamental to thinking about regulating this sphere. And finally, just putting vulnerable users first. That has to be front and center of what we're talking about. Both thinking about the people who are most at risk of harm from people who want to use these chatbots for illicit purposes, and for users who are most likely to be vulnerable to radicalization through these chatbots. Having these users front and center is really, really important. And I will wrap up there. Please feel free either to talk in the Q&A or just to reach out to me. My email's on the screen. Thank you.
Stefan, before I hand it over to you, just a quick point of clarification with Blythe, because I think it's probably something that many of us were thinking, but and perhaps you can't say exactly which chatbots you were looking at. But I mean, if you do feel like saying that, that's one thing, but if you could also maybe just quickly touch on the range of difference between the bots, that would be just a quick point on that would be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, so we were working with a number of different chatbots, which I won't name by the actual bot, but I would say that these were mainstream chatbots that we were working with. We weren't looking at sort of extremist-made AIs. A number of different interfaces, most just worked in a turn-by-turn conversation, emulating a human-like conversation with the bot. Yeah, the mainstream chatbots, basically.
Yeah, so some much more effective at preventing this type of material and information than others.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so one of the things we can perhaps think about in the discussion as well is what kind of safety measures in place and safety by design features should we be considering as well.
Definitely.
Stefan, I'll hand it over to you, please.
Okay. Hopefully I can get to my slides.
Raise it higher.
No. Aha, that's it. Let's start. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share with you basically some ideas and some thoughts and reflections that I've had, and now hopefully it works. Chiefly, if you want, in the aftermath of all the research and the writing that I've done with my colleague Lewis Brace at Exeter. That ultimately was published in this report that was already mentioned, AI Extremism, published a little less than a month ago by Voxpol as a Voxpol report, and you can see the structure of the report here. What we did was to really try and, if you want, place ourselves in the mind of and in the strategy of an extremist actor. You know, what can we get from this kind of these new AI technologies that emerge, that democratize, that get more and more easy to use? What really are the main uses for an extremist of various types of AI models? And so if you're interested in that, we detail all the uses in this report, as you can see in the summary here, in the table of contents. And for most of them, not all, but for most of them, we showed that these uses already, you can find them already in different shapes and forms. Some of them have been already mentioned by the previous presentation. And this is a long-standing interest because a little bit more than 2 years ago, what we did was to train a large language model, actually several large language models, to become proficient in a series of extremist languages or forms of language. So we generated incel forum posts, and we generated white supremacist forum posts, and we generated Salafi jihadi magazines and things like that. And so we tried to test already in the mindset of a terrorist, what can we get out of this? And the main conclusion of this report is that you can get many, many things, and you can get them, it's getting easier and easier to do this. And so the technology, as you would expect with the new technologies, is democratizing, is getting easier to harness. So you have a series of threats, and sitting back after writing all this research and doing all that, we were wondering, and I was wondering what exactly is the nature of this problem, because what's the real significance of this? And I think what we have here, and my presentation is going to try and highlight this, is that we tend to have two major diagnoses that you hear in the press, in the studies, when you talk around about this. One is really that we are approaching a crisis point, right? That this new technology is basically triggering a massive crisis on extremism. I call this the technophobe diagnosis, right? That this technology is, brings about evil and huge problems of a new kind. But you also hear that, no, this is not really a problem, actually. It doesn't really change much. The technology is actually pretty useful to detect and to disrupt and so on and so forth. And I call this a technophile, diagnosis in opposition to this. And I would suggest actually that there is in the conclusion of my little talk here, I would suggest that actually there's a third diagnosis which is more accurate, because both technophobe and technophile diagnoses are not very helpful in determining the prognosis. So what to do and how to do it to react to this. So I would suggest that there is another diagnosis and prognosis that I call the ratchet diagnosis. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to these three diagnoses and prognosis quickly, and then we can have a chat and Q&A. So for the technophobe one, as I said, you hear a lot, especially with people like me, that AI is really a very big thing, a new technology that's very, very useful for extremists, and that these uses are actually critically shifting the balance in their favor, right, against the state or NGOs or big tech, because you have a series of factors. And so the prognosis is that you have a severe worsening of online extremism, really. Like, online extremism is going to get very much worse. It's already pretty bad, but it's going to be much, much worse. And therefore, you will have a heightened threat of terrorism, both stochastic, people inspired, stochastic terrorism, and organizational, because, some of the AI tools are actually pretty good for the organization. So you have a series of factors that push people into that direction. Again, the slides, I think it's the fonts that are a bit problematic. So the first thing is that AI allows for really mass production of extremist content very easily, images, hundreds of thousands. The moment, if you take just one example, the moment when YouTuber and data scientist Yannick Kilcher flooded 4chan Paul with tens of thousands of racist comments, it really proves the point, if you want, 2 years ago. The second thing is that you can, create bots that would significantly boost polarization, echo chamber, but also quantity, but also engage with a kind of chatbots in personalized emotional interactions. And she mentioned the Queen assassination attempt. In that case, what's striking is not that the person interacted a couple of times with an AI girlfriend, but it was like a sustained engagement over more than a year with thousands of messages that were deeply personal and emotional. So quantity and quality to boost artificially echo chambers. We're talking about Russia and China. They're certainly starting this stuff, as they do in West Africa, a case that I study now. Expanded reach, we've seen Al-Qaeda media talking in different languages, robocalling people in different languages, so more reach, more languages. Significant economies of scale, of course. When you put all that together with a couple of people, you're able to mass produce things that previously you needed several teams and specialized people with different language skills. And, you also have things that we don't talk much about, new avenues for blackmail, for harassment, you talked about that, and a lot of opportunities and avenues for criminal behaviors and activities. So this is like the technophobe diagnosis. It's getting worse because and also part of this technophobe diagnosis, we don't have responses at the moment. Perhaps you'll talk on that, but it's very slow to come. There are many limitations. Democracies are particularly not eager to engage in kind of dirty work that Russia is doing. So we don't fix a very big problem. Yet on the other hand, the kind of liberal approach to this is that, it largely benefits humanity. It's a negative externality, AI extremism that can be fixed. It could even be an opportunity. There are many, there are tech solutions. The market will adjust. It will not allow things like, the Tay Twitter account was very quickly removed. So, it will adjust. Over a couple of years, we'll see, the technology getting better. AI is harnessed to detect and counter extremism. National legislation does arrive. So the UK is probably taking the decision to criminalize deepfake porn. It's probably going to move towards criminalizing, political deepfake and stuff like that. So you have ambitious international cooperation, the Hiroshima process, the whatever. So you have a big wave, and things are getting better. The problem is going to be stifled. I suggest that these two diagnoses actually participate to the same kind of narrative, a narrative that you have a huge new technology, an AI revolution that is really shaking everything, right? And that's either very good and enthusiastic or very, very bad that we need to tame. And philosophers of science like Kuckelbergs have shown that actually this kind of revolution, technological revolution narrative typically produces hype and fear scenarios. And I suggest we move beyond that to try and use the classic philosophy of how technology impacts on the relationship between states and criminal actors. So works like the one by Peter Andreas, inspired by Charles Tilly. And that shows that when you have a new threat, it shows two things, that typically states, especially powerful states, seek always to harness technology to expand their powers, yeah? Especially in a world of big competition between different states. The second thing is that typically when you have a new threat, states are eager to tame the threat by harnessing this new technology, okay? And so I suggest that we think about this issue a little bit like this, right? As a ratchet scenario, and I will finish with this. Now we are in the first step. Extremists start to use AI in new ways. Yeah, you start to see these images. You start to see, use of large language models to flood 4chan poll, etc., etc. Yeah. Now states are now starting to seek and gain new capabilities to fight that. Yeah, the U.S. Funding a massive DARPA program to harness AI power to counter the threat. So what we are seeing now is that states are actually gaining some new power capabilities, more surveillance powers, more capabilities to repress, to sue. So states are actually as well gaining power and surveillance capabilities, executive powers. So states are actually getting stronger. Strong states are getting stronger. And big tech, on the one hand, in partnership with big tech. So big tech is actually also getting stronger. And I will finish with that. The logical step forward with that in perhaps a year, 2 years, is that nefarious actors are necessarily going to seek new ways to expand their use of AI in new directions, becoming stronger and more proficient with AI. And this again will prompt the state to step up its use of AI to further enhance its capabilities and repressive apparatus. So what I suggest actually is that both scenarios are actually true together, and that we are seeing a worsening of AI extremism. It's worsening of online extremism very clearly. But when we implement solutions, we have to be careful of what we do, because otherwise we're going to enter the ratchet problem, and we're going to face a state that's ever more intrusive and gains capabilities to also prompt new maleficent uses of AI and enter a vicious circle. So I'm actually quite pessimistic about the entire situation, not just because the AI extremism is growing, but also because typically, as with the war on terror, the state reaction is going to be overblown and prompt new problems, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think when we get to the Q&A, particularly with a room full of practitioners, again, we're going to look for some very practical ways to better counter some of these areas as well, and particular types of skills that might be useful for such work. Yanis, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. That leads nicely into my talk. Thank you, Stefan. Is AI here to save the day from the state perspective? That's a question that I'm mostly going to avoid, because I'm going to talk about the practicalities of implementing AI. There I go. So let me kick off with a question. Who of you has ever used any AI tool? Generative, analytical? Yeah, most. Who of you would say you've integrated any AI tool in your actual workflow? Like if it were removed, you would need some weeks or some months even to like readjust your processes. That's you, 1, 2, maybe 3. Yeah. I think that pretty much reflects the situation in reality and in the law enforcement community and the security services as well. Like the potential, we don't need to argue about this, both malignant and positive. Actually implemented in the everyday work process, there's actually very few tools. Why is that? That I'm going to talk about. Why me? What qualifies me to talk about that? Well, I had the pleasure of being the coordinator for 2 research projects that were aiming at precisely that. Developing an AI-based demonstrator for monitoring far-right and Islamist extremist content on YouTube and Telegram. Who's us? Those were like a number of project partners, one being founder of institute responsible for the technology side, my institute, ISBK for social science and AI training, then huge part legal evaluation advice by CSS Freiburg, and we had 2 practice partners from the intelligence agency, so one intelligence agency, the State Office for the Protection of Constitution in Baden-Württemberg, and the State Criminal Office, so a police agency of Lower Saxony. That is a lot of people to do something that is actually by AI standards pretty mundane. Like we were talking amongst ourselves and Stefan was saying, yeah, AI classifier, we did that too. Actually, a number of you probably have developed an AI classifier on the side in some research project. So why would it need 5 partners and actually like 3 years to develop a demonstrator version? Or let's start at the end. Did we actually manage to develop a ready-to-use AI tool? Absolutely not. But, and that's what I'm going to point out, we didn't even fail. It was kind of by design. And these design issues and practical issues is what I'm going to talk about. And I start with competencies and funding that can get into the way or delay the actual implementation of AI. To get any technology rolling, like there's a number of steps starting here all the way on the left with innovation, so coming up with something that doesn't even exist yet, over adaptation for specific purposes, then building prototypes, somewhere having a finished product, then implementing the project, and then actually using it. So suppose you are a law enforcement agency, security service, and you want to run an AI tool. What are the possibilities you have? First, my excuse, our project was very specifically limited to that sphere, and I'm going to tell you why in a moment. But again, we're thinking from the perspective of security service, what are the opportunities you have to get AI into your department? Buy it. That's, I guess, the most practical way to get it. It's quick and it fits nicely into the procurement routines. Like you do a public call for bids and you get 3 offers and then you decide for the best one. Disadvantage, first, there's not really that many around. Yeah, sooner or later you end with Palantir, and that's legally problematic, at least in Germany. And also, the problem is it's not customized. It's not made for you. And that is actually an issue. Case in point, the German intelligence agencies really drive the differentiation between right-wing extremism, then what's newly called anti-state extremism, and the sovereign citizen movement. They really drive that home. Like it's handled in different departments. Any outside software probably not going to reflect that because that's like a phenomenon that's 2 years old. So you're not going to find it in your software. That's a problem. Also, lack of transparency. You don't know how was it trained. That's going to look bad in court if you make a reasonable explanation for your decisions. So kind of problematic. Second way, you develop the whole thing in-house. Maximum transparency, maximum customization, so good there, but that's usually expensive. We relied on academic exploitation 101 and had like the research assistant do a lot of the legwork, like train the annotation for training purposes. If we were actually pay people fair wages, that would be hugely expensive, and you can't outsource that to click workers. Also, it requires a huge political commitment, and for that I can just quote Lisbeth van der Heijden from a first talk. Nobody does it because nobody knows whether it's legal or not. Same goes for intelligence agencies, and that's the second issue, the legal issue that I'm going to touch upon in a second. So it would require a huge political commitment to go ahead and develop a whole thing in-house or contract something to develop. Also, the scales are correct. Again, we did a 3-year project. For that one step, it would take another at least, 4 to 6 years to develop the whole thing to a product cycle. So we're talking huge time ranges here. Then there's the last possibility, partnering. Like law enforcement agencies, security services partnering with public research. It's very dynamic, very quick. Like we're academics used to write proposals for our lives anyway, so usually quite a lot of interest, and you get, especially anything on the left side, the innovative thoughts can get into the project quite well. It's a good mix of customization, transparency, and outside input, but it's kept at the demonstrator stage. Here I am. That's our problem, because otherwise you would use taxpayer money to develop something that you're going to profit off when you have a product. So it's kept very deliberately at the demonstrator level. Sometimes cooperation can be quite difficult for legal reasons, so also not the perfect solution. Case in point, there's no real perfect solution to even get an AI tool, even if you have interest in it. Then there's the huge issue of legal questions. And here I'm going to specifically address the German situation, but it's, I think, comparable across Europe. Use of AI by security services is obviously a very new and very dynamic legal situation. There are either no regulations whatsoever, so it's not outlawed, but it's also not allowed specifically, or there is legislation that is not yet elaborated by legal precedent. And legal precedent is hugely important here because the devil is in the detail. You probably all know the joke that the lawyer's famous or most favorite answer is, it depends. That is actually true. I learned that in the course of our project, that it actually really depends on the specific use case of the specific AI tool. Is it about monitoring an entire group, an entire milieu? Is it about making assessments on an individual? What kind of data is used? Is data stored or not stored? That is hugely important. It's impossible to all bake that into law, so very much it's going to come down to court decisions in several cases. And there's no way around it. There's no shortcut to it, but that means legal uncertainty, and security services hate legal uncertainty. One thing that we did came away from our project, where again we evaluated the entire legal situation in Germany. Self-learning, one of the strengths of AI, is legally problematic. There need to be a fixed state where you can say, okay, this is what the tool can and cannot do. And that's actually the next thing. Is this tool good or bad? How do we judge that? Intuitively, right or wrong. Like, the tool says me, this is extremist content. Is it right? Is it wrong? This is also how it's going to go in court, but it's not actually fair. We can't really rate AI on whether it's right or wrong. We can rate it on whether it's right or wrong, or how often it's right or wrong compared to humans. And humans, let me tell you, are really divided about what is extremist and what is not. That our team really found out. So we have no real baseline. We're going to have AI, and the AI is going to make mistakes, period. Question is it going to make more mistakes than the human analysts that are working there? We don't know. Nobody's keeping track of that. Also because it's not a clear working stage at the security services. So we don't really know what we can compare the performance of an AI to. Also, there's legal problems in the project themselves that I'm just going to skip over. And then there's the last step, actually making it usable. And it's a lot of work to develop a user-friendly software. That's actually what I'm wanting to address with, like, everybody has done some AI classifier by now, but actually having a data pipeline, having the databases, having a user interface to keep it running without having your data science guy tendency always there, keeping it running, keeping it up, that's pretty damn difficult. And that's also a practical problem in these research projects, because they're highly motivated PhD students who want to do cool AI stuff, and they're stuck doing visualization or programming databases or something like that, because that's just a lot of the work. Again, case in point, this is the outlay of our software, and only here any AI stuff happens. Everything else is just there to make it usable, to keep it running. Then, what's important to make it usable? Good front-end design, so what you're actually looking at, good visualization is key. Practically, otherwise nobody knows how to use it, but also legally, ethically. Like, you all know the human in the loop baseline. What does it actually mean? Of course, AI is not in any near future going to write its own warrants or do its own arrests. But if there's a traffic light system, red, yellow, green, and the analyst is just sticking with the recommendation of the system, that the human is pretty much out of the loop in practice. So the user interface need to show complexity where there's complexity, and not just the answer to an implicit question. That needs to go into there. It requires a good understanding of what the end user is actually looking for. it's about, yeah, we need to find radical content, but that's not really what they're looking for. They want to judge how radical is a certain, say, Telegram group. What are the most dangerous individuals in that milieu, under that YouTube video? What are the most inflammable, most hotly debated issues? Yeah, it's important to recognize radical content, but again, that's not really what they're looking for. You need to adjust, congregate the data into a way that's meaningful to the analysts. How do we actually do that? Well, user trials and feedback are indispensable, but that again is its own legal problem. At least don't know about the Netherlands, for instance. But in Germany, we couldn't have police officers look over our shoulders because this is a research project. In a research project, your main responsibility is to your participants being commenters in that case, or being posters on Telegram, i.e. the radical guys. If somebody were to be targeted by a law enforcement measure based on our research project, that's a huge ethical problem. Then again, the people from the police came in and say, hey, we're under oath. If we see a crime, we got to prosecute a crime. So baseline, we couldn't show some of our stuff to our practical partners. Couldn't get their feedback and had to work around with like non-sworn-in officers doing the evaluation work. That's just a practical issue that makes it hard to get the also important practical input. But that's a lot of problems. My baseline, to bring a little bit of positivity into it, none of this is insurmountable. There is a lot of interest in new technology and also a lot of openness. I know administration doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to new technology. I sense a huge openness to new technology. And I think if the problems that I laid out can be sufficiently addressed, there's nothing really standing into the way. And then we can talk about, okay, how useful is it actually in the big picture? But that's enough for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So 3 very well-balanced presentations here talking about practical examples of AI and exploitation by violent extremist actors, the uses of AI by both violent extremists and counter-terrorist actors, and considering the legal frameworks as well, and some of the practical limitations and barriers for doing so. One quick question for you, Yannis, maybe just to start off here. The legal frameworks that exist in the world today, are they fit for purpose for starting to deal with and respond to AI?
Absolutely not.
Excellent.
But that's generally recognized, so they're going to be changed over the next years. Again, much of it will come down to President and court.
Yeah. This panel was also focusing on misinfo, and I know there were some very light touches of misinfo in our presentations as well. But where do you see AI potentially overlapping or having the most direct effect on areas such as misinformation as well, particularly considering both terrorist and counter-terrorist efforts?
Yeah, I'll kick off. I think it's all sort of part of one problem. I think we're in the phase where we're already actually seeing it. I mean, if you look at misinformation, just even removing AI from it, I mean, in terms of countering misinformation, there's a lot that we still have to actually figure out. If we add AI into the mix, I mean, you're just exacerbating existing issues. We're already seeing, you know, so much misuse of AI in terms of the misinformation field. We're seeing it in advertising, you know, like image generation, video generation, voice generation, making false advertising, you know, more accessible and more difficult to figure out from users. We're seeing it all over the place. Like it's already an issue, and we're seeing it from the extremist side of things as well. We've seen sort of whole misinformation campaigns coming from extremist side of things, and AI just facilitates an existing harm. We are also seeing it from sort of countering. There are a lot of platforms that are already using sort of AI-facilitated detection capabilities in terms of picking up on misinformation, but there are already like a number of sort of pre-existing issues with that as well. You know, like classifying misinformation differs so much from one legal context to another. Classifying what is misinformation and where did this misinformation actually start, getting an AI to figure that out is very, very difficult. And yeah, comparing it to that human baseline, humans are getting it wrong a lot of the time anyway. So when we add AI into the mix, you're just exacerbating an existing problem, I would say.
Any other comments from either of you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been said already. I fully agree. This is really worsening a problem that's already been there. I think we can. 3 cases I think, from the top of my head, that really illustrate the fact that it creates an environment where, you know, it worsens the problem of AI extremism, of online extremism quite a lot. So if you take an extremist environment, even a very big one, let's say the far right / MAGA far right in the US on Telegram, to put like a social media you've seen, it's already very, very big, right? It's in the thousands of accounts and many, you know, hundreds of thousands of, you know, posts, very, very big. But what you can do with AI is you can multiply that fairly easily. So you can create these huge ecosystems where, you know, just chunks of it is authentic. So you can augment the problem. And with the U.S. elections, I'm completely sure that we're going to see a lot of activity and bringing back the foreign powers problem that we've seen in the previous panel. I think, you know, a significant part of that is going to be fueled by Russia. The second example I would mention is actually one that's already fueled by Russia. In the Sahel region in West Africa, Russia is churning out anti-Western and pro-Putin propaganda. Chunks, you know, segments of that is clearly generated by AI. AI imagery, AI text, and the third example is the one that we have seen actually in the election campaign in Slovakia, in which you had that voice deepfake of the candidate. You know, what's the impact of that? It was just one deepfake, but clearly we're in the sort of early tremors of the problem, and we're going to see much more of that. Now, to bring back, and perhaps you're going to add to this, but very clearly, that is something we stress in the report. There is a lot about the legal issues, and we're not sure on how to engage. But you know, in Russia's side, there's no problem with the legal issue, and so we're a very big disadvantage here because they don't care, and they're flooding systems, you know, media landscapes here in France, in Slovakia, in Germany. And we're not doing anything. And we're sort of, oh, but legally it's touchy. We don't know how to share. You know, here I think we have a massive problem in which clearly the link between and the connection between extremism and misinformation is very big, because they use extremism to churn out misinformation about candidates and systems and people.
Let me just add to the legal conundrum, because I think Blythe showed some really nice examples at the beginning of generated pictures. When I encounter these pictures at the groups that we are monitoring, it's very often not even a factual statement that could, if we want to, eventually be prosecuted. So taking the picture of the supposed tunnels under the New York synagogue with a clearly anti-Semitic context, I've encountered something similar, but not the statement, this does happen under a New York synagogue, this is fact. It's just there, and what it does is it creates ambiance, if you will. It clearly adds to the anti-Semitism in the group, but nobody is making a statement that they could actually be called out upon. And in question, it's just fun. Just when in doubt, it's all good fun, if you will. But in a summit, of course, adds up to the psychology, and you both mentioned that, the psychology of these spaces. I don't know how we can actually do something unless the platforms are going to take much greater lead on that.
I think the term ambiance is a really interesting and a very useful one to use to explain the situation here. I know we started about 5 minutes late, so I'm going to give us until 10:02 for Q&A here. So for the folks online too, do feel free to submit questions, but I'll open it up to questions from the room here. Please. We've got the first one just in the front here. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really directed at Stefan, but for everyone. And Stefan, fantastic talk. Is there a potential upside that as more propaganda is AI generated, it will lose some of its traction because it will not feel as authentic?
Are we taking more questions, or should I just...
I think right now we can do them quickly one at a time, but Clarissa, I'll direct you that way to the next hand after the response here.
Okay, so I will quickly reply. This is a point that we raise in our report, actually, which is that we're not going to face like a blanket use of AI by all extremist actors, because it comes at a series of costs and potential costs. Yeah? And one of them is what we call the authenticity costs. Yeah, if you start churning out propaganda, it clearly seems inauthentic, or you may lose legitimacy if you're like a prominent cleric. And you start to do this, yeah, you lose your social capital in a way, and so it has a series of of costs. But so not everyone is going to engage in that in equal manner for all types of propaganda. So I think we're not going to see places where these risks happen because the people won't take the risk, but we are going to see propaganda churned out by groups and movements and individuals where the risk is inexistent. Yeah, so typically on extremist forums or platforms where the onus is on quantity, there's no real risk with that. And so I think that's what we're going to see more and more. So I'm not sure it answers to the question, but that's how I would put it.
Just to jump in on that quickly, I absolutely agree, and I think it's such a good answer that different groups are using this technology differently, and some will care, some don't. In a lot of extremist spaces, as long as you get an image that is somewhat hateful, people are pretty pleased at this point. That will probably change, as we move on. I think there's also a lot of knowledge sharing on how to use these chatbots. Communities are sort of crowdsourcing how you can get the best image out of different sort of image generators, and a lot of the more sort of harmful stuff is also being downloaded and edited offline as well, and then re-uploaded. And sort of that mix of online offline is also where you're getting the more sort of believable images that are used in different sort of harms like child sexual exploitation, etc.
Great, thanks. Interesting. I'm going to play on the theme of the conference. Instead of Houston, we have a problem. Maybe the question being Silicon Valley, we have a problem. My question is a little bit of a follow-up to all of the panelists. This is interesting work, in some ways cutting-edge research from a variety of angles. Have you put this work to the companies that are developing AI? What is their response to it? My perception is that they're either worried about the end of the world or bottom line. How interested are they in actually solving this problem when you're putting it right in front of them to look at?
And would you kindly just identify yourself and for any of the other questions as well, please?
Sure. Yeah, Alex von Rosenbach, former ICCT employee and currently work with NATO.
Anyone like to respond?
So yeah, I can't speak to individual cases, obviously, but I would say it's like most things. You get some tech companies who are hugely enthusiastic about doing better, and some who aren't, and that's part of the issue.
Yeah, one topic that I'm particularly interested in that is that it's not just the big tech companies, but nowadays I think one of the big issues is the one of open science and open source AI, because by now, I mean, we talk about the big AI companies, and they're very keen to be the solution or present themselves as being the solution to the problem they created. Yeah, this is typical in the kind of ratchet stuff, but. On the other hand, you have more and more AI models that are shared as open source, models online. And I think when we really think about AI extremism, these are the models that are the most dangerous. And recently, a paper, a collective paper by many AI scientists, I forget the number, it was quite a lot. It was a paper that tried to list the risks and benefits of open science in AI. Extremism was like a very small paragraph, like two sentences out of the very big paper. And so overwhelmingly, they were like, yeah, there's this little thing, but it's gonna benefit humanity. I mean, that kind of technophile sort of discourse that I talked about. And so I think that. And so it was really, we need to open source everything, yeah. But the kind of open source model were the ones that are the most flexible, that you can train and fine tune to churn out whatever you want and to imitate whoever voice you want to imitate. So I think here we have a problem. Silicon Valley, yes, but not just the very big tech companies. There are two different problems.
Hi, my name is Sigrid Dijkstra. I work for the Dutch National Trading Institute for Countering Radicalization. Thank you for the presentations. I was wondering what we noticed with local practitioners, like one of the issues was what Lisbeth mentioned, that they are not very sure like what they can legally do. Another issue is that they have so many tasks on their plate that they do not have time for many trainings. So I was wondering, does AI mean that local practitioners need additional skills or knowledge, or is what they learn about radicalization enough? And if they do need new knowledge, like what are the main takeaways that they should know?
Again, from the practical side, that's on the developer to not have them learn any new technical skills. It is perfectly possible to design it in a way that you can just use it like your Word or your PowerPoint or whatever like application that is just practical to use. And let me just stress your point. That is exactly what AI is there for. I shamelessly steal a quote from a colleague that I heard at a conference. We don't need an AI for counterterrorism. We need an AI for bicycle theft. Like this mundane work that is actually perfect for being outsourced to an AI. For instance, monitoring radical content, that is the bicycle theft of counterterrorism. So yeah, generally speaking, that would be an area where AI could be really helpful. But yeah, it depends on the practical development, whether they need anything to just use the software, whether they need anything to learn anything new about radicalization itself. I think you know better about that.
My interactions are too limited to, I think, answer the question.
Perhaps more examples of consultation between practitioners and scholars could help answer some of these questions a bit more. But, I see one question in the back here as well. Yes? Very back. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we have we have one question from our online audience. Someone here is asking, you've already explained a bit of the legal unclarity and uncertainty, but do you also have any recommendations on what strategies and mechanisms states can already or should already put in place in the current situation?
Would anyone like to tackle the legal recommendations?
I'm not sure about the legality. But again, I think in liberal democracies, I think we need to shift from, I mean, we already put a lot of impetus on, reaction to a threat, to sort of reactive, monitoring, trying to identify, trying to disrupt perhaps. But I think in the current international issue that we have, that was well emphasized in the previous panel, I think we need to build up capabilities to build more proactive uses of the technology to disrupt rivals in their own turf.
I agree 100%. How are we going to do that legally on the state side? First of all, recognize that these tools exist. Again, current legislation just simply does not do that. Allow for their use. How? First, distinguish the state. Actual legislation need to set boundaries of what is permissible, what is non-permissible, but not try to overregulate. Leave the rest to the administration to do the technicalities. Maintain oversight. What does that mean? Transparency, hugely important. Like that was also mentioned. How does AI derive at its decision? That needs to be made transparent if necessary. And some kind of appeals process. That is really difficult in counterterrorism work. We already touched upon that a couple of times, but it's, at least from the German perspective, German Supreme Court, quite clearly demanded that there's some way of appeals.
Yeah, sorry, absolutely agree with everything that's just been said. I think super interesting, particularly on the point of transparency and oversight, definitely very important. I would also say that I think each of the speakers has kind of had a bit of a cry in what we've been saying, in that we're not really talking in the most case about absolutely new harms. We're seeing a facilitatory environment. So do we need an absolutely whole new playbook for AI? Possibly not, but we need something that is tackling the underlying causes of existing issues as well.
I think that's a great place to wrap up this panel. So before we move to the concluding comments, there will be drinks following this, so you can carry on the discussion and also engage with our speakers over drinks in the lobby after this. But before I turn it over to the concluding comments, I'd like us to again thank our speakers for their excellent contributions today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antoine Barnum. I'm the business manager and deputy director of ICT, for those who don't know you. And before we get to drinks, I'm going to stop you from going just for 10 minutes, nothing more, just to talk to you of some of the ICT highlights of the work that's been done by the team last year and a bit of this year. Some sort of selfish promotion, if I may say. And if this wants to work, there we go, extend the on. One of the first things we want to show you is something we're very excited about, is that we launched, officially today's the official launch, but we soft launched earlier this year, the ICCT Monitoring and Evaluation Center of Excellence. These are the 6 services we offer in the idea to create a culture of evaluation. Now, we don't want to go on and point fingers of who's doing a great job, who's doing a bad job. That's not it at all. The idea is really to say we want more evaluation to see what is working, what can be improved, what can be developed, what needs to continue. So in this sense, because ICT is doing many of its own projects, we want to do many outside of ICT and within the field. So we're going to start doing some trainings towards the end of the year. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get that done. But we also want to create support for practitioners, for policymakers, on how to do evaluation, how to create project proposals, so that there is more evaluation and the field can also improve. We'll also have a help desk where people can come to us. We can have about 30 minutes, maybe more if we really like the topic, for free help to answer some question how people can do better evaluations, better program logic with theory of trends, really to improve the field on and moving forward. One of the core part of ICT is that a lot of our products, as you may know, are open access. And we have here 2 databases that are accessible on the website, fully open access. One of them is on FTF Knowledge Hub. So it looks at 30 countries on qualitative and quantitative data of FTF who went to Syria and Iraq, and what were the challenges and the responses from them states and the best practices. So I think we have, yes, 30 countries so far, the Netherlands obviously being one of them. And the other one is the interlinkage database. So this looks at countries that have prosecuted on the core international crimes, both terrorism and war crimes, and what were the challenges and the best practice on cumulative charges on the both. I learned a lot through these databases, so I really recommend them, especially if someone like me, you don't have a legal background, because it explains on the good logic how the information was gathered and how it can then be used by others. And these are live databases, so we will keep updating as there is new information, and hopefully not new FTF that come to light. For those who like reading, like me, we have 3 books available. They're all available on the website for free, but if you want them on paper, you can buy them here, also on Amazon. Sorry. The first one, it's the Bible. It's from Alex Schmidt. It's huge. It has everything you need to know about the field of CT and PCV as of pretty much today. Definitely not an easy read, but definitely a good reference book to have. The 2 others, Female Jihadis and the Far Right, are from this year. The first one looks at female returnees to Europe, their entire process within the prosecution stages, rehabilitation, reintegration, looking at France, Belgium, and Netherlands. And what are the good practices, what are the challenges, and some recommendation for other countries to keep doing it. So this was only on the female returnees. The other one, that one scared me. It's Russian influence on the far right in Europe in 12 countries, looking France, Netherlands, Germany, we have Slovakia, we have Sweden, and it gives very concrete example of how Russia is influencing the far right. What are they doing? I think there was an echo in the first panel of it, but I would say don't read this at night in a dark room. It's a bit scary. The upcoming one, I'm looking forward to it, from Lone Joanna Cook, is how can we prosecute ISIS, Daesh, for what they did in Iraq and Syria. So this one is going to be coming up soon. And we also have more readings if you want, because ICT is also editing Perspective of Terrorism, the academic journal. It's done by the ICC team. It is open access. It's one of the rare journals that is open access, but on past, current, and future issues. So we really want, as I said, this knowledge to be accessible to everyone. There's also a lot of events, calendar, upcoming topics, and subject on CT, so just beyond the academic research itself. Now, I know a lot of us have a lot of emails. We're not going to do a show of hand who has too many emails, and there's a lot to read. But in case you just want to drive and listen, we also have a podcast. The latest series is on anti-institutionalism, and it looks like first of defining anti-institutionalism, looking at it in the US, in Europe, what are the US responses, and then what were the European responses. And we have distinguished speakers such as Martha Crenshaw, Ian Moss, Eric Abercombe, Julia Ebner, and our own Barbara Monas as well. I listened to it in my car on a 3-hour drive. It kept me awake. I really enjoyed it. And I know I'm doing some selfless promotion, but I thought it was really concrete, really to the point, and really easy to listen. You can get it on your favorite podcast platform, but also online. But there we go. But at its core, ICCT is a project-based organization. So I'll take a few more minutes to show you some of the projects we've done in the Netherlands, in Europe, and abroad. Hope you can read it. Yes, you can read it. The first one was about Utrecht's ideology, where we looked at what is the radicalization going on in the city of Utrecht, what can be done about it. There is a policy brief that's available. It is in Dutch, because yes, for those who don't know, we actually do work in Dutch. We have native Dutch speakers, but you can put it in your favorite translator, or do as I do, try to learn Dutch to be able to read it. But very fascinating, has very practical recommendation for a Dutch municipality on how to counter radicalization. The other one is actually an M&E. We are for a training on municipalities on how to detect radicalization. Our team, actually, Eileen van Leeuwen, who is in the back, and one of our experts, Amy Jane, who will be here tomorrow, are part of the trainings to look at what is the impact of the training. Are the trainees getting what they're supposed to do, and how well are they learning what they're supposed to do? Again, not finger pointing, but analyzing the impact of the training. And I'm actually mentioning a third one that is not up there, a work that's being done by our own Bibi van Ginkel and the rest of the team also meant so. On a pamphlet for the ESS, looking at what are the signs of radicalization, how can you detect radicalization, what it is, in the broad sense of it, and when do you press the red button. So very Dutch-oriented work, but can also have an impact abroad. Within Europe, we have, again, just 2 ones that are available. The first one is a project for the German Federal Foreign Office, where we're looking at anti-governmental threats and their international cooperation. So we're looking at groups, individuals in the Netherlands, Sweden, US, and Austria, how they're interconnected online and offline and a bit beyond, and what are the CT and PCV recommendations we have to these groups, because we know that what goes on in one country affects the others, so it's an overall aspect. It is available to read on our website. The other one was also a training by Bibi van Ginkel on the ESDC, which is the European Security and Defense Cooperative. So this was to increase the cooperation between Europe and Asia. So we're talking about people in India, Japan, Korea, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, and looking at what is Europe doing there in terms of security, and how can we have more cooperation between these countries and the European Union. 3-day training, which hopefully we can do more again and have the information out there. And come on, extend it on a bit more, there we go. Last but not least, what we've been doing abroad. So we've done a lot of work in Iraq, looking into all the Iraqis that are currently in our whole camp, and how can they be prosecuted, but prosecuted following human rights. And we have the area of reintegration and rehabilitation. This is not simply prosecuting for the sake of prosecuting. So these are trainings for the government of Iraq and the technical working group within Iraq. So that was our own Joanna Cook and Tanya Mera. And we're going to have a phase 2 coming up. We're going to keep doing this as well, because there's a lot of work as the caseloads are complex and unfortunately very heavy. Prosecuting for interlinkages. This actually came out from the our own interlinkage database. Indonesia has actually prosecuted people for both war crimes and international court crimes. So the idea was to create a training for the prosecutors and the policymakers on learning on how to prosecute with cumulative charges, what is the good practice, what are some areas for development. And last but not least, it was a work done in Kosovo for the Kosovo Protection Services, because they had a bit of gaps in terms of their understanding and knowledge of rehabilitation and reintegration. So it's a training, a 3-day workshop on a capacity building on how they can fill these gaps. Now, this is just a quick highlight to some of the work we've done. As I said, if you have more questions, we're available to answer questions. And the whole idea of ICT is that this is open access. So all of this information you can find on our website. You can download the reports, you can read them, you can share them. And the books, as I said, you pay them if you want them on paper, but if not, they're freely accessible. So I'll stop here. I'll give it to Thomas for the closing remarks, and then I'll let you go to drinks. Thank you very much.
See, same jacket. All right. Yeah, just to wrap up. As you can see, we've been quite busy. But just to say, obviously, that we've been busy because we have an amazing staff at ICCT. So all of the work, all of the great achievements that Antoine just presented, it's really thanks to all of the people that work at ICCT. I'm extremely proud to be working with such a great team. So please join me in a small round of applause for all of the ICCT staff. And of course, I mean, all of these projects, we're project-based organizations, all of these projects are possible because there's a number of partners, organizations, governments that are trusting us and willing to work with us. So also thanks to all of those who have accepted and be willing to work with us, all of the partners, organizations that have worked with us in those projects, and all of the people, consultants that have also helped us to make all of these projects possible. On this, I also wanted to thank all of the speakers of today for the great presentations, for the insightful discussions. Also wanted to thank all of you for coming here to listen to us here in this beautiful room. If you haven't noticed, the lamps are in the shape of old telephones, which is quite relevant to the kind of discussions that we are having, but also for all the people that have been listening or will be watching this again online. So thank you, everyone, again. Please stay in touch. Please join us for those who are here for a drink, which will be in the room just next door, because again, what we're trying to do is not only feed you, of course, with intellectual things, but also feed you and provide you with substance to exchange. I think that's also what we want to do here, is to create exchanges between all of you here, coming from different countries, from different communities, different backgrounds. So please stay with us, have a drink. Those watching online, go to your fridge, crack a beer, be there with us, and we'll be in touch. Check our website, and thank you very much again. Have a great evening.